Story 1.
Discovering my wife's affair, how I caught her cheating with my best friend and rebuilt our marriage. I doubt strongly that I'm the ideal husband. My job is quite stressful, and there are times when I come home a bit grumpy. Perhaps I'm not the best provider either. I'm definitely no millionaire, but we manage fine. We have a nice home, 2 luxury cars, my wife has a closet full of beautiful clothes, and our 8-year-old daughter, Jennifer, has tons of expensive toys. Ultimately, I'm just a simple, hardworking guy who loves his wife and family. Linda and I have been married for nearly 12 years, and for the most part, those years have been heavenly. I say for the most part because for the last couple of months or so, something just hasn't felt right between Linda and me. It's hard to pinpoint, but she's been acting strangely, somewhat aloof. On numerous occasions, without reason, she's found fault with something I did or said. That's just not like her. I attempted to discuss it, asking if she was upset with me for some unknown reason, but like all women, she'd insist that nothing was wrong other than feeling a bit tired or having had a bad day. Initially, I thought I'd give her some time to work out whatever was bothering her. However, as time passed, her detached attitude became old and downright aggravating. Apart from her attitude, as any married couple knows, a troubled relationship with your spouse affects closeness as well. I've always worked hard to keep our love life spontaneous and exciting, often starting foreplay by bringing a dozen roses home after work. In the past, such gestures never failed to lead to a fulfilling night. Lately, though, my romantic deeds are met with mere thanks and a peck on the cheek. Instead of accepting my expressions of love for what they are, it's as if she thinks there's some feeble attempt to make up for something I did wrong. It's been weeks since Linda initiated closeness, and my advances are either met with disinterest or the classic headache excuse. On rare occasions when she agrees, she remains passive while I do all the work. As time passed, I realized I was starting to mentally detach from the situation. I'd go home, play with my daughter, and pay as little attention to my wife as possible. Making things worse, I felt desperate, so when I had a minute or two at work, I began going over things in my mind. I thought back to when and how everything started. I tried to recall if I had done something that might have triggered the change in Linda's attitude but was coming up empty. I ran a dozen different scenarios in my head, attempting a cause and effect analysis. The more I thought about it, the more one unthinkable explanation for Linda's behavior kept popping up. I wondered if it was possible. Could my wife be cheating on me? I told myself no, she would never do such a thing. But every time I tried putting 2 and 2 together, it was coming up 3, me, Linda, and a lover. I tried telling myself there was simply no way, but you know what they say about curiosity. I did some reading on what kind of things to look for, differences in behavioral patterns, attire, schedules, and the like. Honestly, I hadn't noticed Linda wearing any revealing clothes or dressing handsomer, but then again, I only see her when I get home after work. Who knows how she dresses during the day? I also had no idea of her schedule. She's always running here or there for what? Again, who knows? When it came to her change in attitudes, though, some of the symptoms sounded remarkably familiar. Considering hiring a private detective crossed my mind, but lacking concrete evidence, my thoughts were fueled only by suspicions insufficient to justify the expense of a PI. Thus, I initiated my own investigation. Activities included calling the house during the day, discovering that she was home sometimes and not others. I then obtained an old external surveillance camera discreet, completely mounting it beneath the garage eaves, connected to a hidden tape unit behind some paint cans. My objective was to spot any unfamiliar cars at the house. However, after 2 weeks, no such cars appeared. Observing my wife leaving the house a few times, claiming she was home all day, the duration seemed too brief for any significant occurrences unless her boyfriend possessed astonishing brevity. Perhaps these were minor errands she deemed insignificant to mention, definitely not evidence of an illicit affair. As time passed with no proof of wrongdoing, my suspicions intensified. Her worsening moods and the absence of closeness for weeks left me frustrated. Approaching our 12th anniversary, I viewed it as an opportunity to inject some fun into our relationship. Having not enjoyed a night of dinner and dancing for a long time, I hoped it might rekindle the spark in our marriage. Ready to give it a try, we arranged for Jennifer to stay at my folks' house for an unrestrained evening. I booked a table at Plato's, one of Linda's favorite restaurants. As the maitre d' escorted us to our table, I hoped for the return of our old magic, but for some reason Linda appeared a bit tense. Ordering a bottle of wine with dinner, I observed Linda starting to relax and revert to her old self. Our conversation became light and playful. Post-dinner, it was evident my lovely wife was eager to hit the dance floor. Although I suggested trying a new dance club that had opened recently, she managed to convince me to go to our usual nice venue with romantic lighting and a cozy dance floor catering to an older crowd. They played danceable music, sparing me any arm twisting. Not a bad dancer, if I may say so myself, and this shared love for dancing was one of the things that brought Linda and me together. Securing a private table, we ordered drinks, took a sip each, and then strolled over to showcase more than the two-step. It felt like old times. And we both had a great time. After almost an hour of continuous dancing, we returned to our table for a break. I settled into the chair without fully sitting, while Linda took a sip from her glass of wine before excusing herself to the ladies' room. As I envisioned future bliss, watching my lovely mate gracefully sway her hips, I realized I wasn't the sole observer of her charms. Seated alone at a corner table on the opposite side of the dance floor was a very good-looking guy, attentively observing Linda's every step. Briefly, I thought I saw her make eye contact with him, prompting me to wonder if they knew each other. As she disappeared into the restroom, the guy seemed to glance in my direction with a smug look, though it was challenging to confirm from that distance. The venue, strictly being a dance club, made me ponder why a guy would come alone, concluding that, like Linda, his date was probably in the ladies' room. I kept a watchful eye on him while awaiting my beautiful wife's return. Walking past him on her return, I was certain I saw them both smile and exchange glances. Suddenly, all my suspicions resurfaced. "Honey, would you mind getting me another glass of wine? This one is stale," Linda requested as she sat down. Already feeling uneasy, I didn't like the idea of Linda sitting alone while I waited at the bar for a busy bartender to fill my order. Looking around, I caught the eye of a barmaid. I'd swear Linda looked disappointed as the young lady came to the table to take our drink order. I had a sense that the evening was taking a turn for the worse. He felt it in my bones. Glancing back, I noticed the guy in the corner still sitting alone. I inquired, catching Linda by surprise, about the guy. There was a momentary panic in her eyes before she composed herself. I could tell from the uncomfortable tone that I was on to something. I pressed about the guy she was supposedly making googly eyes at on the way to the bathroom. She innocently countered, denying making googly eyes at anyone. As our drinks arrived, I saw her eyes quickly flick over my shoulder. Mr. Lonely walked up to our table without even acknowledging me. He asked her to dance and I immediately declined. That drew a response from him, claiming he was talking to the lady. I retorted that the lady is my wife, and I decide who she can and can't dance with. Linda chimed in, accusing me of being rude. I questioned her about knowing the guy, catching her off guard. She hesitated and explained he was the one she was talking about. I expressed my frustration, stating he asked her to dance without acknowledging me, deeming it not just rude but extremely disrespectful. Mr. Lonely attempted to interject, but I cut him off, telling him I didn't need his input. Turning back to Linda, I continued, saying that if he had asked if I would mind them dancing together, I might have said okay. But now there was no chance. She responded with an edge to her voice, calling me silly and asserting that nothing was going on between them. She reminded me that while we were married, I didn't own her and she wasn't my slave. If she wanted to dance with someone, she would. I couldn't believe my wife was speaking to me like that, displaying a level of disrespect she had never shown before. I was furious, and any hopes of a romantic evening with her disappeared. Despite my anger, I tried to hold my temper as she continued speaking. Linda expressed a desire for fun in a much sweeter tone. I reminded her that it was our anniversary and that I wanted to have fun with her. Watching her dance with someone else wasn't my idea of fun, especially after I had asked her not to dance with him. I acknowledged that I didn't own her and I couldn't stop her from dancing with him. However, I warned her that if she did, she should get him to take her home, as I would be gone. After 12 years together, I could read Linda like a book, and as she looked into my face, her expression was one of anger. Though I was surprised she couldn't see the same in mine, I mentioned the impoliteness of making the gentleman stand there while we argued. Linda snapped back, declaring she would dance with him and we could talk about it later. The jackass had a triumphant smirk as he extended his hand for her to take. Linda placed her hand in his and they walked to the dance floor together. I left before they even started dancing, and I doubt they noticed my departure. 8 blocks away, my cell phone rang. In a contrite voice, Linda inquired about my whereabouts. I mentioned that I was on my way home to pack a bag. She questioned why and where I was going. I responded that I didn't know yet but was determined to get away. I asserted that I had had enough. Linda expressed disbelief over my decision, emphasizing that it was just a dance and one lousy dance at that. She questioned whether I intended to throw years of marriage down the drain over a dance. I clarified that it had nothing to do with the dance, mentioning my concerns about our relationship. I shared my suspicion of her potential infidelity, particularly with the man she had just danced with. I pointed out the lack of respect he showed, similar to that of someone involved with a married woman. Linda, now speaking in a softer voice, denied any wrongdoing, expressing love and respect for me. I challenged her, citing the absence of closeness between us for over 2 weeks, her disengagement during our encounters, and her recent grumpiness. I accused her of not respecting me, highlighting her behavior that evening. The phone remained silent until she finally apologized. She acknowledged her actions, expressing regret for how she had behaved that night and for giving the impression of an affair. Linda admitted to noticing the man exchanging glances while dancing, but insisted that it meant nothing. She pleaded for me to come back and pick her up. I refused, reiterating my decision to leave. I reminded her of my warning that if she danced with that guy, she would need to find her own way home. I informed her that I was pulling into our driveway, intending to be gone by the time she arrived. I suggested that if she was having an affair, perhaps she should go home with the other man and forget about me. Linda pleaded with me, expressing her desperation and assuring me that she was not having an affair. She suggested grabbing a cab and asked me to stay put until she got home, emphasizing the need to talk things out. Despite the earlier tension, her tone had changed significantly. She begged for understanding before hanging up. I pulled into our drive, went upstairs, and packed a bag. I was out of the house in 12 minutes flat. I wondered if she was really going to take a cab home or if Jackass would drop her off, so I drove down the block, turned off my lights, and waited to see. About 15 minutes later, a yellow cab pulled into the drive. Linda got out and ran into the house. I saw what I wanted to see, so I took off for a motel. Almost immediately, my phone started to ring again. I turned it off. I still had no proof of infidelity, but I had very strong suspicions. I was almost positive Linda and the guy she danced with knew each other. I thought now might be the time for that private detective. If I wasn't home, maybe she'd go to her lover for consoling. The next day, I went through the yellow pages and found the PI with the best ad. I went down to his office and gave him a retainer. After that, I went into work. Tracy, my secretary, told me to call my wife immediately. She said Linda had called 20 times already and something was definitely wrong. I explained that Linda and I were having problems and I was not going to return her calls. I directed Tracy to convey that message during her next call. I also phoned the receptionist in the front lobby, instructing her not to allow Linda access to the offices if she were to come by. I aimed to give the private investigator a chance to uncover information. Now it was simply a waiting game. Later that afternoon, Andrea, our neighbor, called, and though I anticipated the topic would be Linda, I answered to avoid seeming impolite. Linda's friend Andrea initiated the conversation, explaining Linda's efforts to apologize and my refusal to talk to her. I affirmed that I had nothing to discuss with Linda. Andrea sighed slightly, mentioning Linda's denial of any infidelity and urging me not to believe such suspicions. I admitted to believing Linda might be cheating, citing her peculiar behavior for over 2 months and the events of the other night. Andrea questioned my confirmation, as Linda insisted they only danced. I clarified that I witnessed them exchanging looks before the guy approached our table, behaving rudely. Linda sided with him, and despite my warning, she danced with him. I expressed my suspicion that they were romantically involved. Andrea attempted to reassure me, claiming she had not observed any evidence of cheating and emphasizing Linda's acknowledgement of her mistake. She pleaded with me to talk to Linda, insisting that avoidance wouldn't solve anything. I acknowledged Andrea's point but requested time for contemplation. I asked her to convey that I would call Linda in a couple of weeks. Andrea promised to deliver the message, urging me to call Linda. After our conversation, I pondered Andrea's words. Despite the doubts, I couldn't picture her lying to me. Over the next 2 weeks, I remained on edge, checking in with the investigator, who had no updates. Eventually, he called me to his office and handed over a manila packet. Opening it with shaky hands, he instructed me to skip to the bottom of page 5 for the essential information. Nervously flipping through the pages, I reached the bottom of page 5, proof. After an exhaustive investigation, this office found no evidence supporting the client's suspicions of spousal infidelity. I was dumbfounded, unsure how to react. I looked back up at the man across the desk. I inquired about the certainty of the investigator's findings. The investigator assured me that they had tracked Linda's every move for the past 2 weeks, employing house surveillance, call monitoring, tailing her outings, and checking phone records and credit card statements. He conveyed that there were no signs of an affair. Overwhelmed with relief, I struggled to hold back tears in his office. The investigator advised me to go home to my wife and child, emphasizing the rarity of happy endings in his line of work. Expressing gratitude, I left and returned to my motel room, needing time to process everything. Over the weekend, I reflected on every detail. On Monday morning, I called Linda. She answered weakly and shakily. I identified myself and asked if she was okay, expressing concern about her sounding unwell. After a short pause, Linda apologized, admitting regret for taking me for granted. She acknowledged my correctness in warning the guy at the club and started crying again, confessing her lack of respect despite loving and respecting me. Linda pleaded for another chance, vowing never to make the same mistake. Her plea surprised me, considering her attitude at the dance club. When I didn't respond immediately, she assumed the worst. "You're not coming back, are you?" "Yes, I am," I reassured her, clarifying that it would be on a trial basis. I expressed my desire to have my original wife back, the woman I fell in love with and married. Linda insisted that she was here, waiting for the man she loves. Skeptical, I mentioned the bad attitudes, lack of passion, and disrespect I had experienced over the past 2 months. Despite her sincerity, I remained unconvinced. I informed her that I would collect my belongings from the motel after work and be home that night. After a moment of silence, she expressed her love for me and apologized for the way she had treated me. She conveyed her deep regret and emphasized her fear of losing me. I can't say I didn't still have reservations. I was still upset, and even with all the evidence to the contrary, I just couldn't shake the feeling that Linda knew that guy at the dance hall. After work, I picked up my clothes and went home. Jennifer came running and almost tackled me at the door. She asked where I had been. I explained I had been out of town for a while. She obviously knew nothing of our problems. Linda was right there also. She put her arms around me and showered me with kisses. I passionately kissed her back. In the end, I couldn't deny I loved my wife. That was 2 years ago, and married life has been wonderful again. Linda is once more the woman I married, both in and out of the bedroom. A couple of months ago, she threw me a surprise birthday party. In the past, we always treated Linda's birthday as a special day, but only started celebrating mine after my return home. Last night was our 14th wedding anniversary. This time, Linda planned the entire evening. When I returned home from work, she surprised me with tickets for a dinner playhouse to see Man of La Mancha, one of my favorite plays. Later, we drove down to the lakefront and walked along the beach, enjoying the moonlight and warm breezes from the lake. Expressing gratitude for the wonderful anniversary, I put my arm around her and pulled her close. She coyly acknowledged the arousal in my pants, to which I agreed that we should head home to address it. About half an hour later, we were in our bedroom tearing at each other's clothes. To this day, I remain uncertain if she was cheating on me. I'll probably never know for sure, but I'm glad I chose to come back home. Although spring had officially begun on the calendar a few weeks prior, it was only on this day that I could venture out without my winter coat, marking the end of another Chicago winter. Stepping outside, I inhaled the lingering fresh scent of morning dew from an overnight April shower. I fondly remembered the warm, secure feeling wrapped in my husband's arms while listening to the gentle rhythm of the rain. En route to my car, I marveled at the beautiful blue wildflowers resiliently growing in the lawn. Despite the severity of the winter, they persisted in their pursuit of a new beginning, a fresh start at life each spring. I would sing along with the car radio on my way to a quaint coffee shop to meet Kathy, a good friend I hadn't seen in a while. Kathy's son was the same age as Jennifer, my daughter. We became fast friends years ago at a school function and have remained close ever since. Kathy, already seated at a small table in the corner by the window, waved and smiled through the glass as I passed on my way to the front door. The aroma of fresh brewed coffee filled the busy cafe as I joined the line of customers, waiting for my cup of Colombian heaven. Spotting me, Kathy stood up. We greeted each other warmly with giggles as we hugged before taking our seats. I remarked that it had been a while and inquired about how she had been. Kathy's eyes sparkled as she answered. The conversation flowed, encompassing old times and laughter over amusing incidents at school functions. As we discussed our children, we both acknowledged how quickly they grow up. About an hour into our conversation, Kathy leaned over the table and lowered her voice. I mimed locking my lips with a key and responded, "What's up?" Kathy explained that she had been kind of seeing a guy. My head snapped up from sipping my coffee as I met her eyes. I asked, "What do you mean kind of seeing this guy?" "Are you having an affair?" Kathy responded with an impish half-smile. Kathy shared that she hadn't done anything yet but was considering having a fling with a guy named Cody. She acknowledged the naughtiness of it but expressed feeling alive when with him. She admitted liking Cody and feared he might lose interest if they didn't become more involved. In response, I asked if she was willing to risk her marriage for him. Kathy clarified that she had no intention of marrying Cody and just wanted a little fling, referring to it as the spice of life. With a smile, she assured me that she would make sure her husband, Bruce, wouldn't find out, emphasizing how it would crush him if he knew she was with someone else. Kathy added that Cody was married too, highlighting the need for both of them to be cautious. For the past 2 years I had harbored a secret that remained undisclosed, with no intention of sharing it with anyone. As I looked at my friend, I made the decision to take a risk. Recalling the past, I asked Kathy to think back to a couple of years ago when Harry and I were going through a rough patch. She acknowledged remembering it, but mentioned she never knew the details. I confessed that I never disclosed it to anyone, and emphasized the importance of her promise to keep it a secret. After a moment, Kathy assured me that she promised not to reveal it, understanding the potential impact on her own marriage. As a waitress brought fresh coffee, I waited until our cups were filled before continuing. I shared that after 12 years of marriage, I felt a sense of boredom, with everything becoming routine. It was strange, considering all those years had passed, and I found myself questioning what I was doing and where I was going. I felt stuck, lacking a real life for myself. Kathy interjected, expressing understanding of my feelings. She shared that she knew precisely how I felt, believing that most women experience similar emotions. It wasn't about not loving our husbands, she emphasized, as she loved Harry with all her heart. However, suddenly it seemed like that love wasn't enough, and something was missing. She admitted slipping into a slight depression, where nothing seemed fun anymore, not even lovemaking. Despite Harry going above and beyond for her, especially in the bedroom, she couldn't find happiness. Even school functions became a drag, she added. After taking a sip of my coffee and glancing at Kathy to gauge if my story was resonating, I could see that I had her attention, so I continued. I then met Terry. I confirmed it with a slight nod of my head when Kathy asked if I had an affair. I admitted that it was an emotional affair, expressing relief that it hadn't escalated into something physical. I sighed and conveyed gratitude for that. Describing Terry as gorgeous, with rugged good looks, sandy blonde hair and flashing blue eyes like Robert Redford, I noted he was tall, standing over 6 feet. And even with his clothes on, I could see he had a nice build. I acknowledged that I was staring but couldn't bring myself to look away until he caught me. I blushed when he looked at me and smiled, and we started to flirt with each other. The experience was exciting and felt wicked. Eventually, I came to my senses and continued with my shopping down the produce aisle. Recapping, I recounted the encounter when I reached for some tomatoes and accidentally bumped into him. He greeted me with those captivating big blue eyes and a charming smile, saying, "Hi." Kathy uncomfortably, I admitted feeling a physical response, which embarrassed me, hoping he wouldn't notice. I blushed and recalled the awkward moment. Despite observing my wedding rings, he extended his hand for a shake and introduced himself. Surprisingly, his awareness of my status didn't dissuade him from expressing interest, and I found it flattering that someone like him could be attracted to me. We continued with conversation and jokes as we moved through the aisles, gathering the items we needed. Upon reaching the checkout, he offered me his number, suggesting I call him for lunch the following week. Kathy was now hanging on every word of my story, expressing how familiar it sounded, almost prompting me to toss Terry's card away. As I left the store, my thoughts echoed, "God, yeah right, I'm going to call you and we're going to have this intensely hot romantic love affair, and then my husband will finish off us both." I admitted that I didn't throw his card away but kept it in my purse. On the way home, my mind was consumed with thoughts of Terry. When Harry arrived home as I put away groceries, I already felt guilty and snapped at him when he tried to help. It seemed like an unconscious defense mechanism. Poor Harry asked if something was wrong. In response to Kathy's eager question about what I said, I confessed that I lied, telling Harry I was just a little tired from shopping. In truth, I was secretly walking on cloud 9. Continuing my narrative, I acknowledged that I knew I shouldn't call Terry, considering it was wrong, and that I was vulnerable due to my emotions. Despite telling myself, no, I couldn't resist the temptation. I found one of the last payphones in the city and dialed the number on Terry's card. We arranged to have lunch the following day. With anxious anticipation, Kathy waited for me to take another sip of coffee before continuing. On our way to the restaurant, I shared with Kathy that my emotions were all over the place, terrified and excited simultaneously, not to mention feeling incredibly aroused. During our conversation, Terry reached over the table and held my hand, evoking that familiar wetness. It felt like being a kid on my first date. Despite a strong desire to go to bed with him, my conscience or perhaps fear held me back, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. In response to my sharing, Kathy noted that Terry persisted in his seduction, discussing Harry without recognizing the value of the woman he had and failing to appreciate her. Kathy admitted to being influenced by his words, leading to resentment towards her own husband. In a short span, Terry successfully convinced her that Harry was taking her for granted, resonating with the situation she believed she was currently facing. I explained my motive for sharing all this with Kathy, expressing a desire for her to be aware of the situation she might be getting into. Curious, I inquired if the guy she was seeing had begun talking about Bruce yet. Kathy shook her head, asserting that there were no issues in her marriage. However, in the brief pause that followed, I sensed a subtle uncertainty lingering in her words. Continuing our conversation, I probed deeper, asking if she too had started to question her situation. Kathy acknowledged the growing realization, prompting me to reflect on my own experiences. I explained to her how, when Harry left, he pointed out my constant irritability, which I had been unaware of for over 2 months. This pattern extended to the bedroom, where I found it challenging to muster passion for a man who appeared to take me for granted. As I continued with my story, I could see understanding slowly spreading across Kathy's face. I urged her to consider the situation and asked, "Think about it, Kathy. What kind of man has an affair with a married woman? Can you imagine Bruce doing it?" "Bruce? No, of course not. He'd never do anything like that," Kathy affirmed, seeking validation. I then questioned her, "So why risk your marriage over someone who would?" While Kathy pondered the recent revelations, I continued sharing my story. Anyway, we had lunch again the next week, and fidelity to Harry became increasingly challenging. By the third lunch, Terry almost persuaded me to go back to his apartment. Seeing his frustration with my excuses, I realized that another lunch might lead us to bed together. As we left the restaurant after that third lunch, I casually mentioned my need for a new dress, as Harry was planning to take me out for our anniversary. I spoke of a dance club, where we used to have fun, and Terry seized the opportunity. Arrogantly, he declared his intention to be there and dance with me, claiming it would teach Harry a lesson about my desirability. Despite my objections, he insisted it could make Harry appreciate me more. Kathy expressed disbelief and concern, asking if Terry had actually shown up. I confirmed that he did, revealing that I noticed him as soon as we entered the venue. Despite the awkward situation, I refrained from saying anything, not wanting to spoil the enjoyable time Harry and I were having. However, matters took a turn when Terry approached and invited me to dance. Kathy reacted with shock, whispering in astonishment, "Oh my God!" to worsen the situation. Terry completely ignored Harry and behaved rudely towards him. Understandably, Harry became defensive and issued an ultimatum, insisting that I couldn't dance with Terry. Stubbornly, I got angry and declared my intention to dance with Terry anyway, despite Harry's warning that he wouldn't be there when I returned from the dance floor. I dismissed it. As we began dancing, I confronted Terry about his rude behavior in front of Harry, questioning why he had to act that way. Terry explained that he wanted to put Harry in his place, further fueling my anger. Despite Terry holding me close on the dance floor, my primary concern was that Harry was watching, and I feared his heightened upset. I was so preoccupied that I didn't even realize the first dance had ended, and we were already on to our second. When the dance was over, I told Terry not to ask for any more. I insisted I was going to spend the rest of the evening with my husband. On my way back to the table, I noticed Harry was following me. I confronted him, asking what he thought he was doing. He claimed he wanted to apologize to Harry. Upon returning to the table, Harry wasn't there. Terry sat down, stating he'd wait with me until he returned. I doubted he had any intention of apologizing. It seemed more like he wanted to toy with Harry some more. "Why?" Kathy asked. "Why would he want to do that?" I thought about it and concluded he must have figured that since he hadn't succeeded in getting me into bed yet, he'd create trouble between Harry and me. I was sure he hoped I'd turn to him for comfort, imagining he'd console me between the sheets. As the night wore on, I suspected Harry was in the men's room. I told Terry to go back to his table, but he kept stalling. When the waitress came over, he ordered us drinks. That's when she asked if we wanted to start another tab. I wondered aloud about the first tab, questioning its necessity. She explained that Harry had paid it before his sudden departure, leaving me stunned and feeling abandoned. As I narrated the events, Kathy's face mirrored my distress, and her own emotions began to surface. A solitary tear escaped from Kathy's eye and rolled down her cheek. Kathy voiced concern, suggesting we stop discussing it given my emotional state. Despite her suggestion, I insisted on sharing the whole story, believing it was crucial for her to know. I continued, recalling how, in the aftermath, I reached out to Harry, urging him to return and pick me up. That's when he dropped the bombshell suspecting an affair, particularly with Terry. Harry declared his intention to pack a bag, leaving me uncertain about his return. I reached for a napkin, dabbing my eyes as I explained to Kathy how the realization hit me with overwhelming force. It was as if someone had suddenly turned on the lights, bringing everything into sharp focus. I acknowledged that it wasn't Harry taking me for granted. Rather, it was me taking him, Jennifer, and our life together for granted. The weight of risking my entire marriage over someone undeserving struck me. Despite pleading with Harry to return for a conversation, he refused, leaving me with no choice but to call a cab. Kathy, curious about Terry's role in the situation, asked what he had been doing. I shared that Terry persisted, claiming Harry didn't deserve me and urging me to go home with him. I chuckled as I recounted telling him to drop dead. Even after that strong dismissal, Terry tried one last time outside as the cab pulled in. He attempted to kiss me. In response, I swiftly delivered a knee to his groin, warning him of an inappropriate contact suit if he ever tried to contact me again. Kathy reached over, offering support as I wiped away more tears. Recounting the events, I shared how, upon reaching home, I discovered Harry had left. My attempts to contact him were futile, as his cell was turned off. The fear of my marriage unraveling and losing everything we had built overwhelmed me. It was the most scared I had ever been. Desperation led me to confide in Andrea, our neighbor, hoping Harry might open up to her. He did, but his only response was the need for time to think, promising to call in a couple of weeks. Realizing pressure would backfire, I decided to give him space, enduring what felt like the worst 2 weeks of my life. In the presence of our daughter Jennifer, I maintained a facade of strength, explaining that Daddy was out of town. Yet, in moments of solitude, tears flowed uncontrollably. I feared I had irreparably damaged my relationship with Harry, especially if he believed I was unfaithful. In tears, I apologized to Kathy, finding it difficult to discuss even now. After a deep breath, I continued sharing the painful journey. As I revealed the details, I emphasized how close I came to losing everything, and how it made me realize the significance of what I had. Love, I emphasized to Kathy, had to surpass lust. The love between Harry and me was irreplaceable, and I considered myself incredibly fortunate. Kathy responded in a contemplative tone, expressing understanding and admitting she wouldn't know how to handle her husband leaving. When asked if I ever told Harry the truth, I explained that I couldn't risk it, given the closeness of losing him. Living in constant fear of him discovering the truth, I emphasized how I've tried to be the best wife since the day he came home, no longer taking him or our marriage for granted. I expressed gratitude daily and showed Harry my appreciation with passionate sincerity. Despite the lingering fear, I could only hope that my efforts would be enough if he ever discovered the truth. Kathy reassured me with a comforting squeeze of the hand, expressing gratitude for sharing my story and averting a potential mistake. Grateful for the conversation, we discussed tentative plans for our next meeting before parting ways. I felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing I had prevented my friend from making a regrettable decision. Upon arriving home, I had ample time to welcome my daughter Jennifer with a kiss and an after-school snack. Reflecting on how quickly she was growing up, I marveled at the passage of time, realizing she would soon be 10 years old. Time flies, I thought to myself. When Harry returned from work, I greeted him warmly with hugs and kisses. It struck me that I had never opened up about that painful period in our marriage until that day. Conversing with Kathy served as a reminder of the wonderful life Harry and I had built together. Later that night, Harry lay beside me, peacefully asleep. I turned on my side, propping myself up on my elbow, and traced the lines on his face, each one telling a story of the years we'd shared. With a delicate touch, I followed the faint outline of a few wrinkles, my heart swelling with love and admiration for the man lying next to me. Leaning down, I pressed my lips to his, and to my delight, his smile met mine. He pulled me into a passionate kiss, his arms wrapping around me. Whispering, I expressed my surprise, thinking he was asleep. Harry chuckled, revealing he had been deep in thought about Jennifer's upcoming birthday. When I suggested a baby brother or sister for her, it wasn't entirely unexpected. We had discussed it before without reaching a decision. His smile seemed to signal an end to that debate. With Jennifer's birthday just 2 months away, I playfully hinted at getting started. Harry's broad smile indicated he was on board. 2 months later, we celebrated Jennifer's 10th birthday with a big backyard party, inviting all her friends and ensuring plenty of ice cream and cake for everyone. After the festivities, we surprised our daughter with an additional lavish gift: the news of a new baby brother joining our family.
Story 2.
The sky held a deep darkness, visibility non-existent. Upon receiving the signal, 2 subdued shots were fired, causing 2 guards to collapse. Shots continued for the next 15 minutes. Once everything fell silent, the radio echoed. The building cleared, ready for evacuation. 14 years later, I found myself by the hotel room window, gazing at the sunset, reminiscing about how it all began and reflecting on how I ended up here, sipping my vodka. The liquid burned as I swallowed, mirroring the memories of the past several weeks. Nevertheless, I held on to the hope that all was not lost. You see, 6 weeks ago, I stumbled upon the discovery that my wife of the past 12 years was having an affair. The revelation occurred by accident. But isn't that how most clueless husbands find out? By the way, I'm Logan. Jamie and I met during our junior year in college, dated until graduation. I joined the Marine Corps, and she embarked on a job search. Back then, I loved her, but didn't want her to marry me while I was stationed in who knows where. It seemed unfair to her. So, 5 years later, after completing my Marine service, I returned home and within a few weeks secured a good job with a large company in their sales group. It turned out my boss was also a Marine and had a preference for hiring former military types due to our disciplined work ethic. I excelled in my job, making a name for myself. During this period, I decided to re-enter the dating scene, exploring online sites. To my pleasant surprise, I found my college sweetheart Jamie on one of them. God, she looks good in those pictures. Now, Jamie may not have supermodel looks, but she possesses a body. In college, she pursued modern dance, prioritizing staying in shape. And what a shape she has. Standing at 5 feet 6 inches with legs reminiscent of a dancer, she is not overly muscular but curvy, boasting an amazing figure. Her long, flowing, rich brown hair frames her face, accompanied by those dark brown eyes and a smile that melts my heart every time I see it. She exudes that girl-next-door look, sweet and innocent, with just enough amativeness thrown in for good measure. I signed up as quickly as possible and contacted her immediately. It wasn't until a week later that she responded, questioning where the hell I had been and why I hadn't called or emailed her over the last 5 years. If she was this upset at me for not contacting her during my Marine service, then she must have missed me. This was a very positive sign. Soon, we were dating and essentially picking up where we had left off in college. Within a year, we were married, and a year later, we welcomed our first child, Rebecca. My job was progressing well, even though I found myself traveling more, which was anticipated. 2 years later, our second daughter, Amy, came into the picture. Since then, I've been promoted, and we now reside in a lovely house in a good neighborhood with excellent schools. While I still travel quite a bit, sometimes for 2 weeks each month, it's a necessity for my job. It wasn't until a few years later that Jamie began questioning when I would reduce my travel. She missed my presence and felt safer when I was home. I explained that it was a necessary part of my job, assuring her that it wouldn't be much longer before I would be promoted to the next level, reducing my travel significantly and allowing me to be home more often. She reluctantly accepted this, but wasn't thrilled to see me go on my next trip. Looking back, I should have realized there was trouble brewing, but I fully loved and trusted my wife, making me blind to the initial signs of a problem. The first clue was our arguments over trivial matters. Upon my return home, she would blame me for things unrelated to me. If you were home more, this wouldn't happen, or we need you here, not gallivanting all over the country. She had a valid point, though it took me a while to realize it. The second clue surfaced when I found some of her new lingerie in the laundry. While searching for a shirt, I came across silk underwear and a matching silk top. My wife typically has simple tastes, opting for a t-shirt and shorts or sweatpants for bedtime. The only time I'd bought her something from Victoria's Secret, she wore it just once and never again. However, the lingerie I found was unfamiliar, and I assumed she bought it for herself. The third clue was the decline in our bed activity. Our once passionate and romantic encounters dwindled, with her offering various excuses. Exhausted myself, it didn't initially seem problematic, and I believed things would return to normal once my travel reduced. I refrained from pushing her, aware that pressing the issue would worsen an already challenging situation. The final blow was devastating when first revealed, and I was hesitant to accept it. A mutual friend saw Jamie with someone at a farmer's market 40 miles away from our home. Initially thinking it was me, he observed them holding hands, laughing, touching, and kissing. When he approached, he realized it wasn't me. Sensing something amiss, he discreetly walked away, following them for a while until they drove off in a car. I still remember that call. My cell buzzed as I was leaving a meeting. Frank called me and informed me that he had something important to discuss. I told him I was in between meetings and couldn't talk, suggesting we could talk later. Frank agreed and asked me to call him at the earliest opportunity, expressing some concern in his voice. I assured him that I would, and asked if the matter was urgent, to which he replied that it could wait. I hung up, not dwelling on the call, assuming Frank would have informed me if it were urgent. Later that evening, I returned Frank's call. I inquired about the reason for his call and what was so important. Frank hesitated before revealing that he had seen my wife out with another man earlier that day. I asked if she was with a friend, feeling a sense of nervousness. Frank struggled to convey the difficult news, stating that they appeared to be a couple, holding hands, laughing, and kissing. He apologized for being the bearer of such news and suggested that my wife might be having an affair. Those words hit me so hard that I was left feeling numb. What made him think that? We were happily married, and she had no reason to. I couldn't complete the thought. Clues I had noticed earlier suddenly made sense, yet I resisted believing it. Frank brought me back, expressing that he knew it was hard, but I needed to be aware. He suggested there might still be hope to save my marriage and offered his support, telling me to let him know if I needed anything. I acknowledged and thanked him before hanging up, sitting on the bed and grappling with the reality or potential cruel joke. As I pondered, anger intensified at the thought of my wife cheating. During the flight home, I began to cool down and think more clearly about what needed to be done. Without solid evidence, I didn't know where to start. Upon landing, my first call was to Frank, seeking details about the man she was with. Protecting my daughters from our issues was crucial. I wanted to salvage our marriage. Frank advised me not to do anything I would regret and shared that he had a friend who went through a similar situation. He suggested I talk to him for insight on handling the situation, emphasizing the importance of avoiding trouble or making things worse. Frank's advice resonated, and I realized I needed guidance from someone who had faced a similar situation. Right now, the best course of action is to head home and act like everything is normal. If she suspects you're onto something, it'll be tougher to gather evidence against her. I hope I'm mistaken, but I'm certain about what I witnessed that day. Frank was correct. Upon reaching home, I managed to compose myself enough to behave normally around Jamie and the girls. It wasn't a walk in the park, but I somehow pulled it off. In the following days, I searched the house for any clues of her affair, but nothing stood out. Yet, a nagging feeling persisted that I might be overlooking something. Frank called, suggesting I talk to his friend. I agreed to meet them at a bar across town the next day after work, keeping it from Jamie by mentioning late meetings. In the dive bar, I found Frank and his friend Mark in a back booth nursing beers. Frank looked up as I sat down. Mark greeted me as the friend Frank had mentioned. We exchanged greetings, though neither seemed thrilled to be there. Mark spoke, having been briefed by Frank on my situation. He empathized with my feelings but warned against making the same mistakes he did, sharing his painful experience of revenge. It led to a 5-year prison term and losing everything in the divorce and lawsuit against his wife and her boss. He cautioned me against doing anything foolish, his gaze intense. I simply nodded. Curious about alternative approaches, I inquired about what he would have done differently. Mark admitted he'd still go after the boss, but in a subtler manner to catch him off guard. He expressed deep contempt for the man who stole his wife. As for his wife, knowing what he knows now, he'd have opted for a divorce. Our conversation then delved into the do's and don'ts of my situation. The initial step was to secure damning evidence of my wife's infidelity to prevent any denial when confronting her. The second step involved consulting a divorce lawyer to understand how to protect assets and determine my rights in this situation. The third was to keep a substantial amount of cash on hand in case she discovered my actions and froze accounts and credit cards. Lastly, securing a small apartment or alternative living arrangements was crucial in case I decided to leave, ensuring I had a place to stay. While these suggestions were sound, I initially believed I could resolve the issue through conversation. However, as soon as I mentioned this, Mark pounded his fist on the table. Mark emphasized the importance of not doing anything stupid, pointing out that her new boyfriend might be filling her head with tales. He suggested that before approaching my wife, I needed to understand what she had been told and what she believed. Mark drew parallels to my military background as a Marine, highlighting the significance of good intel in battle. He stressed the need for a plan of attack and a strategy for when things go sideways, emphasizing the importance of knowing which way is forward. His question about my military service caught me off guard, and I confirmed that I was a Marine. I questioned the relevance, and Mark continued to stress the importance of having a plan and strategy, drawing connections to my current situation. I sighed, struggling to accept the possibility of my seemingly happy marriage coming to this. Mark apologized quietly, and we sat in silence until Frank broke it, asking about my plan and how I wanted to handle the situation. Realizing the necessity, I expressed my desire to salvage my marriage if possible. But more than anything, I wanted the other man to suffer without risking my own freedom. I made it clear that obtaining proof and intel on my adversary was a priority. Mark smiled at my last comment. He advised against hiring a private investigator, citing his own costly and unproductive experience. With access to her bank, credit card accounts, and phone records, he suggested checking for unusual purchases or calls. Additionally, exploring the possibility of a second cell phone and setting up hidden video cameras around the house for both visual and audio recording. Despite the discomfort, I agreed, determined to make him pay. Our conversation continued for another hour, during which I mentally noted the suggestions offered. Mark's advice emphasized the importance of not discussing the situation at work until I identified my wife's potential lover, considering the risk that someone familiar with my schedule might catch on. He also mentioned he would have approached his wife's lover more subtly, sparking my determination to devise a plan to outsmart this person. However, I needed more information and assistance. The next workday, I scrutinized my upcoming travel plans for the next month, discovering a 2-day trip. Concerned about someone at work knowing my schedule, I discreetly spoke with my boss, suggesting I might extend the client visit to a whole week. He approved the idea without hesitation. The subsequent step involved creating the illusion of being away while secretly returning. Using a prepaid debit card with cash, I purchased a return ticket on another airline. Online, I acquired several spy cameras and a regular camera with a powerful zoom and good low-light capabilities. This constituted the first part of my plan to uncover the identity of this person. The second part aimed to capture them in the act on video, eliminating any doubt of her infidelity. My day was dedicated to meticulous plotting and planning, a skill at which I excel. However, the crucial missing piece of information was the identity of the man involved. Until that was resolved, I couldn't trust anyone, not even my best friend and boss, Hal. Recognizing it would take time to unveil this person's name, I remained determined. By week's end, all the ordered items had been delivered to Frank's home. Now, I just needed the opportunity to discreetly install the spy cameras around my house. With Jamie's Saturday shopping routine with her girls and mother, the house would be empty. After several hours, all the cameras were in place and tested. I could even monitor them in real time from my tablet or laptop over the internet and observe what was happening. With the cameras installed, I proceeded to search the house for clues. Initially, I checked the credit card bills for any unusual charges, followed by an inspection of her closets to see if she had purchased any new, more revealing or shapely clothes. While my search didn't yield concrete evidence, I came across a few newer items, including a very short red dress I had never seen her wear before. The idea of her wearing it for anyone but me troubled me. Despite the lack of definitive proof, the red dress represented a departure from her usual attire, driving me to the point of needing time to think. I opted for a 5-mile jog in my running shorts and shoes, a long run that typically calmed my mind and provided clarity upon my return. As I arrived home, spotting Jamie's car in the driveway, I knew my daughters, whom I affectionately called my angels, were home. Their voices and laughter as I walked in never failed to bring a smile to my face. Calling out to Jamie, I was joyfully greeted by my girls running from the family room to share their day. Jamie emerged from the kitchen, inquiring about my run and kissing me on the cheek before shooing the girls away. After dinner preparations consisting of pork chops, I enjoyed a shower and our evening meal, followed by putting our girls to bed. In the family room, we watched TV, though my preoccupation with thoughts of Jamie's actions during my trips rendered me oblivious to the screen. Feeling overwhelmed, I announced an early bedtime, retreating to our bedroom. In the bedroom, noticing Jamie's purse on the hope chest, I took a chance and searched for clues. To my dismay, I discovered a cheap cell phone previously unknown to me. Turning it on, I recorded the number and reviewed the call log, finding only one unfamiliar number which I also noted before powering off the phone. This newfound evidence compelled me to finally accept the fact that she was having an affair. Heartbroken and consumed with a desire for revenge, I remembered Mark's advice not to act impulsively and resolved to be patient. Quickly changing, I went to bed, pretending to be asleep when Jamie eventually joined me, avoiding conversation to prevent unintentional revelations. The next few days were challenging, attempting to maintain a semblance of normalcy after uncovering damning proof. As the morning of another business trip approached, I went through my usual routine, packing my bags into the car. Just before heading out, I casually asked Jamie if she had anything special planned during my absence, receiving a strange look as she mentioned the usual routine. Racing through possible explanations in my mind, I bid a quick goodbye and drove to the airport, wondering if the cameras in our house would capture her with the person involved. Despite hoping for her decency to refrain from bringing him into our bed, I became increasingly certain that, before all this, she would never have cheated on me. In the following days, concluding my work with the particular client in record time, I packed up, preparing to return home. That evening, I monitored the video feeds from the cameras but found nothing unusual. Consequently, I opted to review earlier recordings. The system initiated recording when someone entered the camera-equipped room, storing all footage centrally, accessible remotely. As I fast-forwarded through that day's recordings, I discovered a moment when Jamie was on her secret cell phone. I stopped and reversed the video to observe her answering the phone, then played it at normal speed. The audio quality was poor, but I heard enough. She was speaking to someone, referring to them as baby. They discussed my absence for the week and the logistics of meeting discreetly at a motel. Despite my urge to hear the rest, she laughed and turned her back to the camera, making it impossible for me to catch the entire conversation. When she turned back, she continued, instructing the person to park down the street at a coffee shop a few blocks away. "Okay, baby, I can't wait. I'll see you tomorrow night." I couldn't believe what I just heard. He was going to be in my house and our bed. Thoughts of disposing of his body crossed my mind, but Mark's warning echoed, urging me not to do anything rash. Suppressing my anger, I resolved to wait for the right moment, though the strain was becoming unbearable. My wife, the love of my life, and the mother of our 2 children, was betraying me. Why was she doing this? What had driven her into the arms of another man? The flight back home was too quick. I wasn't ready for what awaited me. So I checked into a hotel, contemplating my next move. I knew tonight was the night he was coming to my house, and I wanted to see him with my own eyes. Was he someone I knew, or someone from work? That much I needed to know to help me decide how to proceed. With no idea of what time he'd arrive, I knew he was going to park at the coffee shop down the street, so I waited there, even though I had no idea what he looked like. To be safe, I rented a car at the airport, finding a spot with a good view of the parking lot. I brought my camera, checking the zoom quality. I could be at least 100 yards away and get a close-up view of his face and license plate. Around 9 p.m., a silver BMW M3 pulled into the parking lot. I began taking pictures, and thankfully the lighting was good, giving me a clear view of his face. It was no one I recognized. He parked on the other side of the lot, away from the coffee shop, then started walking towards my house. I took a deep breath to control my rage while sitting there. I accessed the Wi-Fi from the coffee shop, viewing the cameras in my house. After several minutes, I saw him enter and passionately kiss my wife. Suppressing my fury, I listened to their conversation. He expressed his thoughts about her all day, and they discussed having the house to themselves until the next morning, since she had sent the kids over to her parents for the night, and I wouldn't be back until Friday. How considerate that she sent the kids away. I observed as he started undressing my wife right in our living room. She reciprocated, and in just a few short minutes, they were undressed, with their hands all over each other. She suggested taking it up to the bedroom, and they both ran out of sight of the camera towards the stairs. As I listened to their laughter, leaving their clothes spread around the floor, I realized I needed to act. Lucky for me, I got out of my car and walked quickly down to my house. The front door was left unlocked as they hurried upstairs, making things easier for me. I went straight for his pants, discovering his wallet with all the needed information and a little extra. With his wallet in hand, I headed to my home office on the first floor, opposite our bedroom, minimizing the risk of being hurt. Switching on my computer and the printer scanner, I waited for them to power up. Once ready, I began scanning items from Stephen Bannister's wallet, copying his driver's license and other details. After returning the wallet, I took pictures of their scattered clothes and started recording what I was witnessing with the camera's video feature, quietly ascending the stairs. As I reached the top, faint sounds of their lovemaking reached me, turning my stomach. The bedroom door was wide open, and they believed they had the house to themselves. Slowly, I made my way toward the bedroom. With their voices getting louder, I found myself in the doorway, observing Steve on his back, undressed, with my wife on top in the classic 69 position, pleasing each other. They were so engrossed that I managed a few steps into the room unnoticed. Aware that the hidden cameras didn't offer the best definition, I desired high-definition footage. I recorded several minutes before resisting the urge to grab a baseball bat and attack him. Mark's wise words echoed in my mind, "Don't do anything stupid." So, I backed out slowly and left the house. Driving back to the hotel, my mind was a mess, and the hate I felt was at an all-time high. I couldn't remember being this mad, and it was starting to scare me. I called Frank, sharing what I had done and the information obtained. Frank acknowledged my actions, but expressed concern about the risk of being in the house again. He apologized for the situation and offered any help he could provide. I thanked him and mentioned my need to talk with someone and my intention to ask Mark for a favor. Frank agreed to arrange a meeting with Mark over the weekend, as Mark had expressed a willingness to help. After the conversation with Frank, I attempted to sleep without success. I decided to clear my mind and work off the rage with my usual morning run. However, it did little to ease my emotions. Following the run, I took a shower and then a long nap to cope with the lack of sleep from the previous night. Returning the rental car to the airport, I picked up my own car and headed straight to the office to check in and talk with Hal. I needed to reduce my work-related travel, and upon entering Hal's office, I closed the door and informed him about my situation. I mentioned my wife's desire for me to be home more and expressed the need for changes in my travel schedule. I looked at Hal, awaiting his response. Hal informed me that my promotion had been approved and I wouldn't have to travel as frequently anymore. It was a welcomed relief, although I couldn't fully grasp it at the moment. My mind was consumed by the knowledge of my wife's affair. Hal noticed my distraction and expressed concern about my recent behavior. I felt compelled to confide in him about what I had discovered. I told him about catching my wife with her lover and recording them together. Hal reacted with shock and sympathy, offering his support. I explained that I needed to be home more to salvage my marriage, and I asked him to keep the situation confidential, fearing someone in the office might be involved in leaking information about my schedule. Hal agreed to cover for me if I needed time off to gather evidence against my wife. I expressed my desire to confront her with undeniable proof to either salvage the marriage or protect myself in a divorce. Hal nodded in agreement, promising his assistance and discretion. After thanking Hal, I left his office feeling a bit relieved that things were falling into place, even though deep down, I knew my marriage was beyond repair. I went home that night and tried my best to act normal. My girls attacked me as I walked through the door, and I had to keep from crying, thinking how they would be affected if a divorce were to happen. I didn't like the idea of having to get permission to visit my own children. I have to get the custody of my kids. On Saturday, while my wife and kids were out shopping, I met with Mark and Frank at a diner. I updated them on the progress I'd made in gathering information. Mark remarked on my courage and expressed surprise that I hadn't taken more drastic action. He then asked how he could assist me, mentioning Frank's mention of my time spent in prison. Both Frank and Mark regarded me with curiosity. For the next hour, I explained my plan and outlined what I hoped to achieve with Mark's connections. When I finished, Mark smiled and expressed admiration for the plan. He mentioned knowing someone who could potentially assist me and suggested they might be able to recommend others, though he cautioned that they would likely expect payment. Mark agreed to make some calls to his contacts. I handed him my cell number and asked him to contact me once he had spoken with his friends so we could arrange a meeting to finalize the details. After discussing a few more ideas, I planned to implement them as soon as possible. I realized I needed to make some additional online purchases to prepare for the next phase of my plan. The rest of the weekend went the way most weekends go, with one noticeable difference. Sunday night. My wife and I usually make love that night. This time she wasn't feeling well. It wasn't the first time this happened, so it was not surprising. But it had been over a month since the last time we were close. My next trip was coming up, and I asked Hal for the following week off. But if anyone called the office, they were to be told I was on a normal business trip. He had no problem with that and wished me luck. So now I had to let my wife know my next trip was going to be longer. She was not happy, but that was to be expected. I reassured my wife that my frequent traveling would soon come to an end, and that I would be home more often. Trying to lighten the mood, I joked that I would be around so much she'd get tired of me. However, she didn't respond with a smile. Instead, she sighed and told me to call her when I arrived at my destination. Her demeanor was distant, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our marriage was coming to an end. I rushed out the door before I said something I'd regret and drove to the airport again. The meetings with these clients went very well, and a deal was reached early, so I was able to fly back a day sooner. I kept checking the cameras during the week, but he didn't reappear at my house. But I did see her on that secret cell phone of hers, so I listened to her conversation, and I knew this was the opportunity one was looking for, even though it smacked me to hear what she was planning on doing. I went to the office and found the items that I had ordered waiting for me. Knowing my wife's normal routine, I could easily set up one of these items that I got with little chance of being caught. She went to the gym 4 times a week, and I knew where and when, so I had her spare car keys and was able to place the item where she wouldn't find it. Next, I went to Steven's condo to see if he was there. I saw his car parked in the carport, so I assumed he was home. I brought my camera and was checking if I could see him inside. I got very lucky as I saw him through his sliding doors and that he wasn't alone. He was with another woman, and they seemed to be romantically connected as they were kissing and touching each other as a loving couple. This was too good to be true, as I took a video of their affection for each other. When I saw them leaving together, I followed at a safe distance. They went for lunch, and this gave me a chance to place the other item on his car. This was a little more difficult and dangerous if someone saw me, but I was able to do it without being caught. Now all I needed to do was wait. That was the hardest thing for me to do. I received a call from Mark, who informed me that he had a friend who could assist with my plan. We decided to meet in my hotel room to avoid being seen together in public, considering the nature of the activities we were planning. When they arrived, Mark introduced me to Joe, a computer hacker who could help with our scheme. Over the next hour, I recounted the details of my wife's affair and expressed my desire for revenge against her lover. I showed them copies of the contents of the man's wallet that I had obtained. Joe raised concerns about the legality of our plan and demanded to know what was in it for him. After considering for a moment, I offered Joe $5,000 in cash. He agreed to the terms, but insisted on receiving half of the payment up front and the remainder upon completion of the job. We discussed the need to gain access to the man's condo to access his computer and gather additional evidence against my wife. With the intel I had on Steven, Joe used my laptop to review his recent purchases. What stood out were the 2 airline tickets to Las Vegas and a hotel reservation for 5 nights. This signaled our decision to break into his condo, prompting Joe to ask if he knew whether there was an alarm system. I admitted uncertainty, so Joe agreed to investigate and get back to me. If an alarm system was present, he insisted on an increased payment for facilitating our entry. I agreed to pay him more, contingent on justification. It appeared my wife was planning a final trip with this individual. I checked my tablet to confirm the functionality of the tracking devices I placed in their cars, accessible via my tablet or smartphone, to monitor their locations. Additionally, I examined home video cameras, confirming she had packed a small carry-on bag for the trip. The day arrived, and I monitored their progress from my hotel room. I called Joe, and he agreed to meet later that afternoon. While he hadn't identified any visible alarm systems, he emphasized the need for caution. We met a few blocks from Steven's condo and discussed the plan for gaining entry. Joe, drawing on his prison experience, possessed the skill of lockpicking. It was just after sunset, and the growing darkness would help maintain discretion. Joe, with his laptop in a messenger bag and my camera at the front door of Steven's condo, immediately knelt down and worked on the locks for almost a minute. Soon, the door was open, and we entered. first checking for any signs of an alarm system. Satisfied that none existed, we proceeded to locate Steven's computer. Fortunately, it was openly accessible, allowing Joe to carry out his tasks. I interrupted saying, "Wait," as I slowly recorded a video of the room's layout. "I want to ensure we leave everything as we found it." Joe nodded in agreement, acknowledging the importance of leaving no traces behind. He resumed his work as I explored for potential incriminating evidence. Browsing through his mail, including bank statements and credit card bills, I ventured into his bedroom, capturing video footage. The remarkable cleanliness and high-end furniture suggested affluence, leaving me still uncertain about his profession. Joe's exclamation of "pay dirt" brought me back to the living room. He successfully accessed Steven's online bill payments, discovering checks and extra credit cards. I was pleased, having brought a card reader to record information from the magnetic strip. Joe proposed making copies for online purchases, potentially maxing out his cards in a few hours. Joe grinned and inquired if it was possible to empty out the man's bank account. I confirmed that it could be done, intending to carry out the transaction from the man's computer to make it seem legitimate. Joe mentioned the possibility of the bank calling to verify the transaction, but assured me that no password was necessary, as I had already copied the man's social security number from his wallet. I chuckled at the man's carelessness and gave Joe the go-ahead to proceed. Expressing my desire to inflict maximum damage on the man, I suggested emptying his bank account immediately and sabotaging his credit cards on the day of his return from Las Vegas. Joe enthusiastically agreed, referring to it as a fitting homecoming gift. He emphasized the importance of covering our tracks to avoid any repercussions. I reassured him that I was taking precautions to avoid detection, pointing out the latex gloves we were wearing as evidence of our caution. I went back to search through his bedroom and didn't find much until I looked in the back of his closet. I found a shoebox with several recordable DVR discs. They were labeled with the names of women. As I pulled out the box, I dumped it on his bed and started to sort through them. I didn't recognize any of the names until I saw Jamie's. That idiot had recorded the two of them together. But why? Joe called me over to the other room to show me something he had found. He explained that the man we were targeting was involved in blackmail, possessing numerous videos of women with Steven. These videos showed the women's faces clearly, but Steven's face wasn't always visible due to the camera angles. Some emails indicated that the women were being extorted for money, with threats of using the videos against them in court. Joe speculated that Steven preyed on married women with children, exploiting their vulnerabilities for his gain. Seeking retaliation, I asked Joe if Steven kept all the videos on his hard drive. Joe replied that he wasn't certain, but suggested that the DVDs found in the closet might contain the only copies. I decided to gather the DVDs and search for a backup drive, but couldn't find one. Returning to Joe, I learned that he had located the backup drive. After instructing Joe to do a full backup and wipe the laptop's drive, I explained our plan to bankrupt Steven by ruining his blackmail scheme. I also expressed my desire to inform the women involved that they were no longer under threat. I asked Joe to print out all relevant emails so I could set up an email account to communicate with them. He offered to set up the account from Steven's computer, and I agreed to the idea. After wrapping things up, I did one last sweep of the place before we locked up and departed swiftly. Back at the cars, I gave Joe an envelope containing the remainder of his payment, expressing my gratitude for his assistance. We shook hands, and he assured me he'd be ready to carry out the next phase of our plan when needed. With that, he drove off, and I returned to my hotel to continue implementing my scheme. I called my in-laws to check on my children. My father-in-law answered, and I greeted him cheerfully, inquiring about the kids and expressing my hope that they weren't causing any trouble. He reassured me that the children were behaving well and mentioned Jamie's weekend trip with her friends. I feigned ignorance and said I hadn't spoken with her yet, emphasizing that I wanted to ensure the kids were settled before contacting her. After our conversation, it was evident that Jamie's father had no knowledge of her affair in Las Vegas. It further solidified my disdain for her actions. My next call was to the house, which I knew she wouldn't be there, so I left a message. Then I waited an hour, and when she didn't call me back, I called her cell again. She didn't pick up, so I left a message saying I was worried that I had called the house and you didn't answer or called me back. and now you don't answer your cell. Please call me just so I know you're okay." I also added that if I didn't hear from her within the hour, I was going to call her parents. 15 minutes later, I received a surprise call from Jamie. She asked if everything was all right, mentioning that she had tried calling the house but received no answer. I assured her that everything was fine, explaining that I had taken the girls to my parents' house after spending time with friends. Jamie's response sounded somewhat tense. I suggested we have a night out together once I returned home in a week, but her response seemed uncertain. Feeling suspicious, I pressed Jamie, teasing her and attempting to make her nervous. She claimed to be tired and hinted at wanting to end the conversation. Respecting her wishes, I bid her good night and expressed my love before ending the call. Despite my efforts to remain calm, anger began to resurface within me. I didn't sleep well, and so I was up early doing my morning run. I got back to my hotel room and took a nice long shower. Afterward, I called the office and checked if anything needed my attention, but all seemed to be going smoothly there. Then I got the call. Every parent fears Rebecca was injured at school and had to be taken to the hospital. At that moment, nothing mattered to me more than the safety of my child. The school called my house first. When no one answered, they tried to call me at work, which in turn, someone from my office called me. I called the school back, and they informed me she had broken her arm and was at the emergency room being treated. I rushed out the door and went straight to the hospital. Once there, I called Jamie's cell, and when I got her voicemail, screamed into the phone that if she didn't call me within the next 15 minutes, the next call I make is to a divorce lawyer. It was an hour later that my cell rang. I saw it was from Jamie. I rejected the call and sat with my daughter as the doctor set her arm in a cast. She was crying, saying she wanted mommy. I wanted to comfort her, but I didn't know what to say. It took some time, but she finally settled down, and I took her to her grandparents. My phone rang again, and again I rejected. When I had calmed down, I made a call to a good divorce lawyer and set up an appointment for the following day. Then, Jamie called again. I took this call. She greeted me sarcastically, commenting on my supposed luck at the blackjack tables and informing me that she had contacted a divorce lawyer. Through tears, she threatened to use the videos she had of me and Stephen together as evidence to gain full custody of our children. I reminded her of her absence when our child was in the hospital, crying for her mother while she was with her lover in Las Vegas. Attempting to reassure her, I suggested that she could start a new life with Stephen and potentially have more children. She insisted that it was me she loved and wanted. Feeling conflicted, I ended the call, unable to bear the emotional turmoil. I took Rebecca and Amy home and helped them pack their bags with some clothes and brought them to my hotel and got them their own room next to mine. Then I called Jamie's father and told him what happened at school, and that for the time being, we won't be living at home until some things can be resolved. My father-in-law called and asked about the situation between Jamie and me. I explained that we were having some problems, but suggested he speak with Jamie for more details. He informed me that he would be taking care of the girls for the time being until he was sure of their well-being and safety. Although he didn't fully understand, he wished us the best and hoped we could resolve our issues. I then contacted my lawyer and instructed him to proceed with serving my wife. Next, I called Mark and instructed him to wreak havoc on Stephen by maxing out his credit cards, emptying his bank accounts, and damaging his credit. Later that night, Jamie called me in distress. Initially hesitant to answer, I eventually did after receiving a text from her. She tearfully explained that Stephen was blackmailing her, threatening to share videos of them from Vegas with others. I responded coldly, suggesting that she had brought this upon herself by engaging in the affair. I hung up, knowing that Jamie needed to face the consequences of her actions. She had chosen to leave her home and marriage for her own pleasure, and now she would have to face the repercussions. After deciding to end things with Jamie, I needed to address her lover, Stephen. I called Mark and informed him that I had contacted my lawyer to have Jamie served with divorce papers, which would take a few days. Meanwhile, I wanted to move my money offshore, ensuring that only my funds were protected. Mark questioned my decision, but I assured him that I was done with Jamie and was determined to give her what she deserved. Mark mentioned a change in plans and suggested meeting at 5. We convened at a dive bar and engaged in a lengthy conversation that lasted almost 2 hours. Before parting ways, we shook hands and I handed him a substantial envelope. For the next 3 days, Jamie kept calling, and I kept ignoring. I wanted her to suffer. Friday evening, I got the call I was eagerly waiting for. It was a video call. I answered on the other end. There was a man tied to a chair and all bloodied. A voice in the background informed Stephen that his friend had a message for him. Stephen, looking at the screen, was addressed by someone who mentioned his recent trip to Tijuana and the exhaustion that must come with it. The speaker hinted at Stephen's financial troubles and suggested that his current situation would help him hide from the bank. The speaker continued, mentioning someone named Santiago and his special stew, hinting at a sinister implication. They explained that they could have pursued legal action against Stephen for alienation of affection, but opted not to waste their time. The message concluded with a farewell to Stephen, indicating that someone named Mr. Lopez was now involved. I saw Stephen for the last time that day. In his eyes, I saw fear. That is what I call a good investment. Stephen was still alive when he was lowered into the giant blue drum filled with Santiago's special mix. No one ever heard from him again. No one even asked about him. 7 months later, I was a free man. I got the custody of my daughters. I get to keep the house till both my daughters are 19, and then we can sell and split the difference. There was no alimony or child support. I wanted nothing to do with Jamie, but she has visitation rights, and I usually drop the daughters at her place and drive away. A year later, I started dating Lisa. She was previously Amy's schoolteacher, and it seems that Amy likes her company more than her mother. I have not decided on getting married, and I'm taking this slowly.
Story 3.
My parents excluded me from our Christmas family postcard, saying my wheelchair would ruin the photo, but included my adopted brother instead, leaving me heartbroken. I, 17, female, have a younger brother, Nathan, 15, male. And I always had this feeling that my parents preferred him over me. Nathan is adopted. My parents adopted him around 9 years ago, but he fits right in with our family. In fact, I would even say that he looks more like a part of my family and like the kind of child that my parents should have than I do. I'm not saying this because I want to, but because my parents have joked about this several times. I feel like they really don't mean it as a joke. My family is really conventionally attractive, and I'm not even kidding, they could be on the cover of some family magazine. I, unfortunately, don't really fit in. I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes as a kid, and that made it very difficult for me to lose weight. My parents tried to control my portions, and whatever I consumed was strictly monitored by them, but that's no way to live, and I used to literally have to eat in secret because it genuinely felt like they were starving me. It was already very difficult for me to maintain a healthy weight, and because of my irregular eating habits, it became impossible for me to lose weight. And I'm going to be honest, I'm quite overweight now. Then, around 6 months ago, I was unfortunately diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and for the past 3 months, I have been forced to intermittently use a wheelchair because the symptoms are so severe and I have flare-ups quite frequently. But I don't really know what the reason for that is yet, so I can't even prevent that from happening. Life had already been pretty difficult for me earlier since I had been an introverted kid, and even at home, the way I was treated was not exactly ideal. But now, after my diagnosis, things have taken a turn for the worse. Earlier, I was just overweight, but now I am that fat kid in a wheelchair. I was struggling mentally, and my parents did not do anything to help me improve my situation. Instead, they started making it even worse for me because, from their behavior, it was pretty apparent that they considered me a burden on their family. So I just started restricting myself to my room as much as I could because I really did not want to bother them, and it is incredibly lonely, but I can't help it. I really don't want to feel like I'm constantly disappointing everyone around me. I always kept feeling like they didn't really want me as part of their family, but I would deal with it by shaking these thoughts off. However, after the incident that took place a couple of weeks ago, it became much more difficult to just do that. Almost 3 weeks back, my parents were discussing the Christmas postcard that we send out every year to the rest of the family, and the next day, like every year, I got dressed in the red outfit and went to the living room so I could be a part of the family photograph. It's been a ritual for years, and I thought that even though everything had changed, at least this would remain constant, and I would still continue to feel like part of my own family. But they took that away from me as well. As soon as they saw me, they got really awkward and said that they had thought that maybe this time it would only be the 3 of them because I was in a wheelchair that day. And they didn't want to spoil their photograph. I was shocked that they would even say something like that, but I tried to bargain with them. I said that I would try to stand for a couple of pictures, and it really wouldn't be that bad for me. But they insisted that I should stay in the wheelchair and just let them take the photos. That made it very obvious to me that they did not want me in the picture anyway, in the most literal sense of the phrase. So I went back to my room and cried myself to sleep, and the worst part was that nobody even came by to check on me. It was a horrible day towards the end of a horrible year, and I just couldn't bear it. So that day, I finally called my grandmother up and told her everything that was going on. My grandma is my dad's mother, and she's a wonderful person. My grandpa passed away when my dad was just 10 years old, and since then, she has built a life for herself from scratch. She's really strong and inspirational, and she loves me more than anyone else. I would have gone to live with her, but I was really holding out on the fact that at some point, my parents would probably change and treat me better. But that day, I realized that it was never going to happen. My grandmother knew that my parents didn't exactly treat me well, and several times she had asked me to move in with her if I wanted to. And that day, I told her that I really wanted to go away. I wanted to leave this house and live with her because clearly I was not wanted here. I had known that for a really long time, but I had still been fighting with myself, trying not to believe it because, at the end of the day, they were still my parents, and this was my family. But if this was my family, I was probably better off without one. She was the one who was there for me that day. She calmed me down and comforted me on the phone while I continued to sob. She also told me that she would be there in a couple of days, as soon as she was back from her cruise with her friends, and then she would take me away with her. Yeah, my grandma has a pretty cool lifestyle. Anyway, I made her promise that she would take me away, and after that, I did not say anything to my parents because I had realized that it was not worth it. They did not even bother to apologize to me after that particular incident for excluding me from the photograph. They pretended like everything was normal, and so did I, because I knew that I was going to be rescued from this place soon enough. And my grandmother, true to her word, showed up at our place last week. For 7 entire days, I had barely spoken to my parents or Nathan. All I did was go to school, come back home, and then stay in my room for the rest of the day. But on the day that my grandmother visited, I was the one to open the door to her and invite her in. My parents did not have a clue about what was going to happen, so they seemed pretty relaxed to have her around and were acting as if everything was normal. But my grandmother was having none of it, so she asked them why exactly I hadn't been included in the Christmas postcard as soon as she was seated. The postcards hadn't even been sent out yet, so my parents were really confused as to how she found out. But then they figured out that I must have told her about that incident. And instead of acting apologetic for it, they turned to me and rolled their eyes at me, saying that I had no reason to make a big deal out of it and complained to my grandmother about that. They offered the same explanation once again. They did not want to bother me by having me stand up for the picture, and if I had my wheelchair in the photo, it would spoil the photograph. So far, I hadn't said anything, but then I took the opportunity to point out that I had told them that I was fine with standing up for a couple of minutes, but they were the ones who had refused. And that obviously meant that they really did not want me in the picture. I pointed out that they had always treated me like an outsider in my family because I did not fit in with them, even though that was not even my fault. I told them that it was ironic that even though Nathan was adopted, they treated him more like somebody who was actually their flesh and blood, as opposed to me. They only considered me a burden. Even though Nathan and I used to be close when we were children, he had observed the way that our parents treated me and had chosen to distance himself from me as well. So in the end, I was left with absolutely no one in this household. At least then, Nathan had the good sense to look away because he knew whatever I was saying was true. My parents got mad at me instantly for saying that Nathan was adopted, as if he didn't know. Obviously, he was aware of it because he was 6 years old when he came into our family. And I had never thought of him less as my brother, just because he was not biologically related to me. But my point was still true, that he always received the treatment that I didn't, not because he looked more like my parents' kid and I did not. And maybe I had kind of started resenting all of them a little bit because of how I was being treated. Even then, my parents did not take the opportunity to apologize or even act like they were sorry. They just said that I was acting spoiled, and I was being nasty by bringing up the fact that Nathan was adopted just to justify my behavior. They even went on to say that they expected an apology from me now. I was about to argue even more, but I guess my grandma had had enough by that point. She intervened and said that there was no need for that. She was here to prevent exactly this kind of mistreatment from taking place anymore. My parents looked confused. So she told them that she was taking me off their hands since they had never bothered to hide the fact that they considered me a burden on the family. I was turning 18 in a couple of months, so there was no real need to bother with custody and whatever. I could just go live with her, and it would be completely fine. My parents seemed shocked for a couple of minutes. Nobody said anything, but then they said that if my grandmother really wanted to take me with her, then she was free to do so. They were not going to stop me. They didn't even put up a fight, and it just proved all my theories to be true. They really didn't want me to be a part of the family. With me gone, it would just be my parents and Nathan, and then they could finally have the picture-perfect family that they had always wanted. When my parents said that they were fine with my grandmother taking me away, I thought that we were going to leave immediately. But my grandmother just smiled and said that they had acted exactly the way she had expected them to. And then she brought out some papers. She said that she should have done this a long time back and told my parents that she was cutting them out of her will, and now, after she passed away, everything that she had would go to me and Nathan. At first, I did not realize the implications of this, but I guess my parents did because they immediately flew into defense mode and said that it was incredibly unfair for her to treat them like that just because I was bratty and entitled. I guess I hadn't really thought about it, but my grandmother was pretty wealthy since she was one of the top real estate agents before she retired a couple of years back. So it would make sense for her to have a lot of money. And I hadn't really thought about it because I love my grandmother for who she is, not because of her money, unlike my parents. Anyway, then she told my parents that she would not be leaving anything to them, and even showed them the paperwork for it. They started bawling and said that she was being horrible and that she just couldn't do this to them, but my grandmother literally did not care. She just told me to go back to my room, pack everything that I needed, and then come along with her. Thankfully, I had pretty much kept everything packed, since I had a week to prepare for this, and I only had to drag everything out. Even when I was doing that, my parents just kept crying, begging, and bargaining with my grandmother, but she just ignored them. Nathan did not say anything. He just sat quietly in a corner, trying to disappear from the room itself. While I was leaving, he was the only person who bothered to say goodbye to me, and my parents were too busy trying to argue with my grandma to even notice that I was also leaving. Soon enough, we had driven away, and since then, I have been living with my grandma. Her place is a lot closer to my school as well, so I get to sleep in a lot longer since I don't have to wake up early for the bus and I can just walk to school. I feel like I should have switched to living with her earlier than I did, but at least it's better late than never. My parents have not bothered to contact me since I left, but Nathan sent me a text soon after. He acknowledged the fact that I had never treated him badly, but he had actually distanced himself from me, and maybe unknowingly, he had allowed the way our parents treated me to influence his behavior towards me as well. He hadn't even realized it until I had brought it up, but now that he knew about it, he wanted to make it up to me by apologizing. He said that he was really and truly very grateful for this family, because had it not been for us, he probably still would have been stuck with his biological parents and had a much worse life. He was not just thankful to my parents for adopting him, but also to me for always treating him like my own brother, and to my grandmother as well. Nathan told me that he wanted to have a fresh start with me, and so we have been hanging out at school so we can repair our relationship. It's been a bit weird for the past couple of years. Ever since he turned 13, he had been very distant from me, but now I feel like I'm slowly getting back to the old Nathan who used to put me on a pedestal. Anyway, this is not about that. It's just that he said something to me in passing yesterday while we were hanging out that really stayed with me. While talking, I just happened to ask what was going on at home because I couldn't resist wanting to know what my parents were up to. Nathan told me that the situation at home was not looking too good because apparently the blame game between my parents had started already. My mom was blaming my dad for pushing me away my entire life, and even for the incident that took place the other day because apparently it had been his idea not to include me in the picture. My dad blamed her for making me feel like I was a burden because most of the time, it was my mother who would overreact, and it felt as though having me as a child was the toughest job in the world for her. Nathan told me that at the rate that things were going, he's afraid that they might file for a divorce. And he mentioned it to me very casually, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since then. And I know that it's very stupid of me to think about it and even consider this possibility, but it's just that I have started feeling like if they get divorced, it might be my fault. It might be because I overreacted, because maybe they genuinely did not mean to make me feel like a burden or whatever. They probably did not even intend to offend me on the day of the photo shoot, but I took it to heart. I honestly don't know what to think, but I know for a fact that I will be very upset if my parents decide to get divorced. No matter what is going on with me and them right now, I feel like an idiot and a doormat for even considering these things, but I can't help it, it's just what's going on in my head. And I have tried everything to push it out of my mind, but I just can't do it. So that's why I'm here, since I feel like I need reassurance right now. And there's no better place to seek that unbiased and objective opinion than Reddit. So, AITA for getting offended that my parents didn't want me in the family photo for our Christmas postcard and telling my grandmother about it? Edit. Okay, so just to clear up a couple of things. My grandmother changed her will and left everything to me and Nathan because our parents had screwed up, but Nathan had not. I will admit that the way he had been behaving with me had not exactly been nice, but again, he's just a kid. So am I. He's not even close to 18, and I think he deserves a chance to redeem himself. Both my grandmother and I believe that he does not deserve to be punished and pushed away by his family because of what our parents did. If we act the same way, there's literally no difference between us and my parents, so I think it was pretty fair for my grandmother to include Nathan in the will as well. And as for people who were asking about his birth parents, his mom was around 19 when she had him and had had to drop out of college for that. And the cherry on top, she was struggling with substance abuse too. Nathan's father, unfortunately, took off a couple of months after he was born and came back into his life intermittently. My parents knew Nathan's biological mother's cousin since they went to college together, which is how my parents were able to find out about Nathan. Nathan's maternal grandparents had tried to give their daughter several chances to clean up her act and be a good mother to him, but she just couldn't do it. So when Nathan turned 6, his grandparents decided to talk their daughter into giving him up for adoption because not only was she ruining her life, but she was also spoiling his future. And my parents, coincidentally, had been thinking about adopting a second child because they wanted another kid. But my mother's first pregnancy had been pretty complicated, and she did not want to take the risk a second time. So Nathan's aunt spoke to my parents, and they fostered Nathan for a while before officially adopting him. His grandparents have stayed in touch with him, and he meets them every month, but he has never met his parents after he got adopted. His mother claims that it's been hard for her to see him again, and his dad has just disappeared from his life entirely. Ever since then, he has been my brother. There has been no debate about it. I might have brought up the fact that he was adopted, and I kind of feel guilty about it. I shouldn't have done that, but I was just very frustrated, and in the heat of the moment, I kind of lost the plot. But I have apologized to him for it since then, and we are trying to get back on good terms because I really don't want to lose him. We lost each other for a couple of years because of our parents, but we are not going to let it happen again. In fact, I have even told him that if things get too hard for him back at home because of how much our parents are fighting, he's welcome to come and live with me and our grandmother. Update 1. Hello, thank you so much for all the comments, and thank you so much for all the support that you guys have shown me. It's been a bit overwhelming for me to deal with it, but it makes me feel better to know that there have been a lot of people who have been in a similar kind of position because I was feeling really alone before this. However, knowing that you guys have made it through gives me hope. I took the suggestion that most of you guys had. I spoke to my grandmother about what I was feeling, like I was responsible for my parents fighting, and she, like everyone else, told me that I had nothing to feel sorry about. I had finally taken a stand for myself after years of tolerating the way they had mistreated me. There was nothing wrong with that. I had done literally everything in my power to make them realize what I was worth. I had put up with them for so many years and tried to assimilate myself into their family. But they kept rejecting me and pushing me away again and again. And now that they did not have anybody to blame, they had turned on each other instead. And that's really not my fault. I don't need to beat myself up about it, and that's true. I guess right now my parents don't have anybody to blame in the household, and they don't want to take it out on Nathan. So they are taking out all their anger and frustration on each other. If they get divorced, it'll be very sad, but it's not going to be my problem. And if they decide to stay together, that's still better for them. Whatever happens, I'm going to stay out of it. I have spoken to Nathan about this as well, and he told me that he had just told me what was going on at home because I had asked. But he did not intend to make me feel guilty about it. And I know that, so I told him that it was not his fault anyway, but I just wanted him to know that if he wants, then he can come and live with me, because I know that he might end up blaming himself as well. And I don't want that for him. He told me he would think about it, but right now, he would prefer to stay with our parents because he still owes them this much. And I kind of understand where he's coming from, so I have no grudges against him. We have promised each other that no matter what happens with the rest of the family, we are not going to allow that to turn us against each other, and I'm really hoping that we are able to stick to that. Update 2. Hi, so my Parents came to visit me today, and when I came back home from school, they were here, sitting in the living room with my grandmother. As soon as I walked in, she told me that they were there to talk to me, but I was in no mood to talk to them since I had a pretty crappy day at school as well. So I told them that whatever it was that they had to say, they could put it in an email or they could come by later because I was really exhausted and I just needed to take a nap. But they told me that they had specifically taken time off from work to talk to me because they wanted to take me back with them. I would be leaving for college in a couple of months, so they wanted to spend the last couple of months before I left with me. They said that they were there to apologize if I had felt offended by their behavior. Now, people can say that I have been nitpicking, but I really don't like the way that they phrased it. Because what does it even mean to say that they were sorry that I felt offended by their behavior? Their behavior was offensive. That's why I felt offended. I knew that I had been doubting myself for a couple of days, but circumstances have changed now. I know that everyone agrees that what they did and the way they treated me was unacceptable. So I told them that the only reason I had been so upset was because the way they treated me was not right. I was offended because what they had done was offensive. There was no question of an if situation arising. But instead of taking that in their stride and correcting themselves, they told me that even I had been very distant from them. So of course they had no idea what I was going through. It just made me realize that no matter how hard I tried or how hard anyone tried, my parents were beyond apologies. I told them to leave, because I knew that they were just going to try and gaslight me further into believing that this was all my fault and eventually get me to apologize to them instead. I wanted to save myself the trouble, so I just told them to leave, but they refused to even get up and said that they were not going anywhere until I had sat down and dignified everything with a discussion because they deserved that at the very least, especially after everything that they had done for me, which just meant normal things that every parent does. I didn't even want to argue. I just rolled my eyes and started to go back to my room. Then my dad yelled at me and said that I was not allowed to leave without talking to them. Thankfully, my grandmother was right there, and she was not going to let this kind of behavior fly in her house. So she told my dad to keep his mouth shut and his voice low because after the way he treated me, he had no right to scream at me just because I had made the right choice for myself and left them. She instructed my father to apologize to me and said that if I did not want to speak to him, there was nothing that she could do and that they had to leave, because she was not going to allow them to mentally harass me again and again just because they were worried about their reputation and their image. They were obviously only here to get me back with them as they were worried about what people would think if they discovered that I had moved out and was living with my grandma. But I didn't care. I had my own future to look out for. My parents tried to speak to me again, but I just told them to leave me alone because everything was still too fresh and I was not going to move on anytime soon. So eventually, they had to leave because my grandma was not going to allow them to stay much longer. After they left, she asked me if I wanted to see them again, and I told her that for a while my answer would be no. So the next time that they try to visit, my grandma is not going to invite them in. I spoke to Nathan about their visit as well, and he told me that he had no idea. They just came back home a couple of hours ago. They looked very disappointed, and nobody had even come out of their rooms in a while. I guess it's pretty depressing for him, but I can't help it. It is what it is. Update 3. Hello, folks. So I'm leaving for college in a week. I got into my first choice, and I'm really looking forward to my future now. It's going to be very difficult being on my own, but my grandmother has made all the arrangements prior to the move, and she's going to stay with me and help me settle into my apartment for the first couple of weeks. My parents and I have not spoken for the last couple of months, and my mental health has improved considerably. I'm no longer breaking down randomly during the day, so I guess staying away from them has had its benefits. Nathan has told me that things have pretty much gone back to normal in the household. And I guess they're also not any worse off without me, which makes me feel a little bad. But I'm happy for Nathan. We have obviously kept in touch, and we are going to try and get on FaceTime at least once every week. I'm going to miss my life here, but I'm excited for the future. Thanks for checking in on me.
Story 4. In the beginning, life felt effortless, almost as if the world conspired to bring Gwen and me together. We met by chance at a minor league baseball game on a warm summer evening, and from the moment I saw her smile, I knew my life would never be the same. Gwen's energy was infectious. She radiated a quiet confidence, and her laughter could light up even the dullest of days. Those early years were filled with the kind of magic you only find once. Long conversations that stretched into the night, spontaneous road trips, and a shared vision of a future that seemed unshakable. As we built our lives together, our bond grew stronger, and I truly believed we could overcome anything. Gwen's ambition and determination inspired me daily, and I admired how she threw herself wholeheartedly into her career. I often told her she could conquer the world if she set her mind to it. But as the years passed, I began to notice how that same drive sometimes left her overwhelmed. Work demands increased, yet she never let it show, at least not at first. We reassured each other during those challenging moments, leaning on the promise that our love would always be enough. But life rarely unfolds the way we imagine. Subtle shifts started to creep into our relationship, almost imperceptible at first. Little by little, our carefree days gave way to routines dominated by obligations, and the laughter we once shared seemed more distant. In hindsight, it's clear that those changes planted the seeds of what was to come. Gwen and I were approaching our 4th anniversary, but something between us had shifted over the past few months. It started after her promotion to project manager. She took over a critical project when her boss stepped aside following a heart attack. The added responsibility brought long hours and intense stress, triggering Gwen's latent OCD. Our time together dwindled, and despite my efforts, cleaning, laundry, and foot rubs, my support seemed unacknowledged. Soon she withdrew entirely. My words annoyed her, my touches were unwelcome, and I felt like I was living with a stranger. When I confided in friends, they were surprised. Paul, my closest buddy, summed it up. Les, that's rough. Most couples hit a slump, but this early? Are you sure you're not imagining it? I explained that we hadn't been intimate in weeks and shared some of Gwen's sharp comments. His shock turned skeptical. Could she be cheating? I shook my head. No way. She's too busy with work, leading a massive platform overhaul that could make or break her career. Paul nodded. Then she's buried in stress. Just don't jump to conclusions and accuse her of anything. A supportive partner matters now more than ever. On another day, a stranger at the bar muttered under his breath, "Nothing worse than a non-supportive spouse, except a cheating one." That struck a nerve. Determined to trust but verify, I casually offered to bring Gwen lunch at work the following Saturday. She happily agreed, requesting pizzas for her and her team. When I delivered them, she introduced me to her co-workers, including 2 recent hires, Brad and Clark. Everything seemed normal. Over the next few weeks, I kept tabs discreetly and found no evidence of wrongdoing. Still, the emotional distance between us lingered. Finally, I decided to take a different approach. One evening, I set the table with candles, wine, and a homemade dinner. When Gwen came home, she seemed taken aback but smiled. "This is lovely, Les," she said, kissing me. After dinner, I handed her an envelope. "I know work's been overwhelming, but I think we need to reconnect. After your project wraps up, I've planned a week-long vacation for us. It's booked for next month. First-class flights to a couple's resort in the Dominican Republic. We have until tomorrow to cancel." Gwen flipped through the brochure, her eyes welling with tears. "This is perfect," she said, moving to sit on my lap. "Thank you. I can't wait to spend this time with you." She kissed me, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had my wife back. The next month crawled by. Gwen's project wrapped up smoothly, with only minor issues to address, and our intimacy slowly returned. It wasn't the fiery passion we once had, but once-a-week connection was a step forward. The day of our trip arrived. We packed light, 2 small suitcases, a backpack, and Gwen's purse. I planned on living in shorts and polos, while Gwen had packed a few sundresses, shorts, and 2 bikinis that promised a hot week ahead. Excitement buzzed as we stood in the first-class TSA line ready for a fresh start. Then, out of nowhere, Brad showed up. Gwen froze, her voice sharp with surprise. "Brad, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," he said, ignoring me completely. Annoyed, I jumped in. "Can't this wait? She's on vacation." Gwen's tone shifted, firm but tense. "Les, please go ahead. I'll catch up. This won't take long." Reluctantly, I left her with Brad and headed through security. At the gate, boarding began. I tried calling Gwen, but it went to voicemail. My texts, first, "Where are you?" then "You're cutting it close," were met with silence. The plane doors closed. My phone buzzed. A single text from Gwen. "I'm so sorry." Panicked, I asked the flight attendant if I could leave. Her sympathetic look said it all. "We can't return to the gate for that," she said, handing me a small bottle of bourbon. 5 hours later, we landed in Punta Cana. I immediately called Gwen, but she didn't answer. Instead, I saw her voicemail. "Les, I'm so sorry. Please read the email I sent you. It explains everything. I'm sorry to take the coward's way out. You deserve better." Dread filled me as I opened her email. "Les, I thought this trip could help us start over, but I can't keep lying. For the past 4 months, I've been having an affair with Brad. I never meant for it to happen, but it did." Her message went on. Apologies, excuses, and a full confession. I sat there, reeling. By the time I cleared customs, my hollow expression must have alarmed the agents. They pulled me aside for questioning, but after showing Gwen's Dear John email, they let me go. Defeated, I headed to the resort, hoping for a bed and some solace. Instead, I hit another wall. "Where's your wife?" the check-in clerk asked. "She couldn't make it," I replied, forcing calm. "I'm sorry, sir. This is a couples-only resort. We can't check in single guests." Desperation bled into my voice. "I paid $5,000. Can't you make an exception?" Rules were rules. The night manager kindly arranged a room at another resort and sent me there with a driver. Alone, in a strange place, I stared at the ceiling that night, wondering how it had all fallen apart. When I tried to check into the second resort, my credit cards were declined. Frustrated, I used my emergency card, another decline. I called Gwen, but she didn't answer. The bank's hotlines confirmed my worst fear. Both cards had been canceled. Desperate, I texted Gwen, "Why did you cancel the cards?" Her reply came 10 minutes later. "Brad thought it made sense since the resort was prepaid and all-inclusive. He said you wouldn't need them." Reading her message, I unleashed a string of curses that startled the hotel clerk. Thankfully, I had over $600 in cash, enough to pay for the night, though the dingy $300 a night room barely felt worth it. With half my cash gone, I sat on the bed trying to process everything. I couldn't access my bank accounts, so I called my brother in Denver. After convincing him and his wife that I wasn't joking, I endured their shocked reactions. "Not Gwen! And that witch!" Eventually, my brother agreed to wire me some money the next morning. Next, I called the airline. My return ticket wasn't transferable, thanks to my choice of the cheapest option, and buying a new ticket required cash in person. The soonest flight home was a red-eye on Tuesday. Left with nothing but time, I opened Gwen's email for the second time. "Les, I'm so sorry. I thought this trip might help us start fresh, but I've been lying to you. For the past 4 months, I've been having an affair with Brad. It started as emotional support during late nights at work. I resisted at first, but one Saturday, after the rest of the team left, I gave in. I wondered why you didn't notice me pulling away, and that only drew me closer to him. Now I see how many times you asked what was wrong and tried to help. But when you planned this trip, something clicked. I realized I wanted to save our marriage. The next day, I ended it with Brad, but he didn't take it well. He kept trying to pull me back in, and I was too weak to resist. Even at the airport, he convinced me to stay, saying you'd hate me once you found out. He was probably right. I couldn't face 5 hours sitting next to your anger. I need this week to process what I've done. By the time you return, I'll be gone. Please, don't hate me. I know I can't fix what I've broken, but I hope you find peace. With regret, Gwen." The letter answered a few questions, but left me angrier than before. Her affair had likely been happening right under my nose at the office. With an hour until the bar closed, I headed downstairs. A drink seemed fitting, a toast to my cheating wife and the end of my marriage. Growing up, my dad had drilled 3 rules about drinking into my head. "Les, getting drunk won't solve a thing. Don't be the weeping whiner, the violent jerk, or the laughing fool. Drink slow, enjoy the buzz, and know your limit. And if I ever catch you drinking and driving, I'll take away your car, no matter how old you are." Dad wasn't a teetotaler. He could hold his beer with the best of them, but I'd never seen him drunk or reckless. Tonight, his words echoed in my mind as I sipped my bourbon, steady and controlled. It was time to figure out how to start over. I knew I wouldn't linger in the bar past 2 beers, but I planned to enjoy them. Sipping my first President, I scanned the room. A few couples danced, including one pair awkwardly grinding to the beat. An overweight man with a rail-thin woman who could have been Olive Oil's twin. The bartender caught my eye, and we shared a knowing laugh. The absurdity of it all struck me. At least his wife didn't leave him stranded at the airport, I thought bitterly. My mind spiraled. Had I messed up? Was my marriage a lie? Or had something real fallen apart? For 5 years, 4 of them married, I thought we were happy. I nursed my drink, lost in memories of how it all began. We met at a Chiefs baseball game in Peoria, Illinois. Gwen stood out in a Ryan Sandberg Cubs jersey, a striking blonde with long legs and a quick smile. Although the Chiefs were a Cardinals affiliate, Cubs fans were common enough in the area. She was with friends, and I seized the chance to introduce myself by buying their group a round of beers. I used her jersey to start a conversation. "You're too young to be a Sandberg fan. Wasn't he before your time?" She smiled. "It was my dad's favorite jersey. He gave it to me." I held out my hand. "I'm Les." "Gwen," she replied, shaking my hand. She was an IT major finishing her senior year at Bradley University. I'd graduated 2 years earlier and was working as a design engineer at Caterpillar. Our small talk eventually circled back to Sandberg, and Gwen shared her dad's love of the Cubs. Dad always said the best days of his life were marrying Mom, having my brother and me, and watching Sandberg hit 2 homers off Bruce Sutter. Your dad played baseball? Yeah, in AAA for the Cubs, but never made it to the majors. We hit it off immediately, chatting until the game ended. She gave me her number, and I called the next day. By the weekend, we were on our first date. A few months into dating, Gwen finally came back to my place after dinner and a movie. We sat on the couch kissing when she leaned back and whispered, "Take me to bed." "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said. "I haven't been with many guys, but I want this with you." We headed to my room, where I fumbled through my nightstand for protections I hadn't touched since we started dating. Gwen chuckled at my sheepish confession of celibacy. She preferred the lights off while I liked them on, so we compromised by leaving the hall light on, letting it spill gently through the doorway. As we got ready, I couldn't help but admire the elegant lingerie she had chosen. It was stunning. "I put this on for you," she said shyly. "Now I don't know if I should admire it longer or take it off," I teased. Gwen placed my hands on her bra clasp, silently answering the question. What she revealed was breathtaking, perfectly shaped and inviting in every way. I lavished attention on her, teasing and kissing her body, but when I tried to move lower, she stopped me. "No, don't," she said, firmly. "You'll like it," I promised. "Not tonight. Just make love to me." I didn't push. There'd be time later to explore. She was tight and ready, her body responding despite her shyness. Our first time was tender but reserved. Gwen, though stunning, was hesitant and restrained. She clung to my shoulders, avoiding eye contact and saying little. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, a beginning. I realized early on that Gwen was inexperienced when it came to intimacy, but she was open to exploring, albeit cautiously. She was often hesitant when I suggested something new, like trying different positions or BJ, but she would eventually go along. She drew the line at mutual touch yourself, though, shaking her head at the idea. Our first night together was a good example of her initial shyness. After we made love, she curled up in my arms and asked for a shirt to sleep in. "No, we sleep in the nude," I said. "I've never done that." "You'll like it," I reassured her. And she did, falling asleep in my arms, her body pressed against mine. The next morning, she asked again for something to wear. "No, stay nude," I replied. She hesitated but didn't argue, walking to the bathroom and then joining me in the kitchen. She avoided eye contact, but I couldn't help admiring her graceful frame as she moved around my apartment. Over time, Gwen became more open. A month later, we started exploring new ways to connect on a deeper level. One evening, during an intimate moment, I noticed her reactions were particularly emotional and memorable. That night became a special moment that we both cherished. Outside the bedroom, we meshed well. The only friction came from her fiercely competitive family and friends, especially regarding sports. Once, we watched Purdue play Bradley in basketball at a pub with her group. Every time Bradley scored, one of her friends was in my face, cheering obnoxiously. Luckily, Bradley won, sparing me their wrath. When they demanded I buy the next round, I refused, insisting the winner buys, which didn't win me any favor with her crowd. Gwen stayed neutral, neither defending nor criticizing me. Meeting her father was another story. That Thanksgiving, after 4 months of dating, I accompanied Gwen to her parents' house. Her dad greeted me politely until Gwen jokingly announced, "Watch out, Dad! He's a Cardinals fan." His expression darkened, and I knew I was in trouble. This was 2011, years before the Cubs' historic World Series win, and her father, a former Cubs farm system player, clearly wasn't amused. Knowing I was already in a tough spot, I tried to downplay my allegiance, but I sensed 2 strikes against me. He likely guessed I was sleeping with his daughter, and now I was a Cardinals fan. For the next 5 years, he treated me like I was on probation, waiting for me to mess up. Despite the tension with her dad, Gwen and I grew closer. After Thanksgiving, she prepared to graduate and start her job at State Farm in Bloomington. I called her father to ask for his blessing, bought a ring, and proposed on Christmas Eve. Gwen said yes through happy tears, and we began planning a July wedding. We respected her family's preference for no premarital cohabitation, so Gwen kept her apartment with her roommates, though she stayed at my place most nights. After the wedding, we moved into a small farmhouse midway between my job in Peoria and hers in Bloomington. Our wedding day in late July was perfect. We honeymooned in Miami Beach, where Gwen turned heads in her tiny bikini, classy but alluring. For the next year, we made love every day, blissfully happy. Over the next 3 years, we planned for children and a house, aiming to start a family before Gwen turned 30. Then, 4 months ago, everything unraveled. And now here I was, thousands of miles from home, alone in the Dominican Republic, sipping beer and wondering how it all went so wrong. The bartender rang the bell for last call, signaling the end of a long night. I finished my second president, left a generous tip, and thanked him for providing a quiet space to think before heading back to my room. Monday morning brought more headaches. I discovered that all our shared bank accounts had been closed. Thankfully, my brother had wired me money, which I collected at Western Union before heading to the airport. The earliest flight I could get was Tuesday night. Resigned, I returned to the resort and extended my stay by a day. To avoid wallowing in misery, I went for a run along the beach, followed by a swim in the warm ocean. Still, seeing happy couples everywhere only deepened my sense of rejection. I retreated to my room, ordered room service to avoid more reminders of what I'd lost, and spent hours absorbed in a spy novel from the hotel boutique. Tuesday passed in much the same way, a run, a swim, and a quiet lunch in town before heading to the airport. 7 hours of waiting turned into more reading, and the red-eye flight offered little rest. After landing and enduring a 2.5-hour drive home, I finally stood in our bedroom, staring at the empty space where Gwen's clothes and belongings had been. By Wednesday noon, I woke from sheer exhaustion and called a friend to get the name of a divorce attorney. That afternoon, I met with Henry Abbott, a no-nonsense lawyer who assured me he'd protect my interests. He had me document every detail of the ordeal, from being stranded in the Dominican Republic without funds to the money I spent getting home. He also requested a full inventory of our shared assets and anything missing from the house. Henry warned me Gwen might try to serve me first. Letter. It positions her as the one ending the marriage, and will gain insight into their strategy, he explained. Sure enough, Monday morning, Sarah, our office administrator, informed me someone was waiting to see me. It was a process server with divorce papers. As I read through the papers, anger surged. I almost called Gwen to confront her, but stopped myself, remembering a friend's cautionary tale about a similar situation. Instead, I handed everything to Henry, who assured me we'd handle it. 2 months later, I sat in a courtroom, nerves frayed. The judge entered, a woman, and I braced myself for the worst. Gwen's lawyer presented their demands while Gwen avoided my gaze. Notably, Brad was absent, a calculated move, I assumed. When it was our turn, Henry laid out the facts, emphasizing Gwen's unilateral decisions and my abandonment overseas. The judge, clearly prepared, turned to Gwen. "Miss Harper," she said, addressing Gwen by her maiden name, "you've made no allegations of offense. Did you leave your husband simply because you fell in love with Mr. Bradley Parker?" After conferring briefly with her attorney, Gwen answered, "Yes, Your Honor, there was no offense." The judge nodded. "Thank you for your honesty. False claims of offense are something I do not tolerate in my courtroom." She reviewed her notes before delivering the ruling. "The divorce is granted, effective immediately. There will be no spousal support. Each party will retain their personal retirement funds and possessions. Joint assets will be split 50-50. From Ms. Harper's share, she will reimburse Mr. Lester for $9,000 in vacation costs, expenses incurred in the Dominican Republic, and return airfare. Additionally, she will cover all attorney fees for both parties and pay $3,200, representing half the rent for the 7 months since she left the marital home." The judge turned to Gwen, her expression firm. "You claim to have loved your husband. If this is how you treat someone you love, I can only imagine how you treat those you don't." And with that, it was over. No celebration, just relief. And the weight of starting over. The ruling left me speechless. Of the $20,000 in our savings, Gwen would be paying me back nearly $16,000. As my attorney Henry and I left the courtroom, Gwen called out behind me. "Les." I ignored her, stepping into the hallway where Brad sat waiting. He began to stand, but I was already in his face. "She'll cheat on you too," I said, walking past him without waiting for a reaction. Outside, I turned to Henry. "Lunch is on me," I offered, and we headed to a diner across the street. "I thought I was doomed when I saw the judge was a woman," I admitted. Henry chuckled. "That's a common misconception. Honestly, it's usually the older male judges who hand the cute wife everything. Judge Carter, though, you couldn't ask for better. She's tough but fair, and she doesn't put up with nonsense." "You knew it'd be her courtroom. Why not tell me?" I asked. "No need to get your hopes up or make you nervous," he said. She's been married to the same guy for 40 years. He's a machinist, great golfer, and everyone at the club loves him. It's a true partnership. They're equals. She values that, which worked in your favor. Over lunch, Henry shared a story about Judge Carter putting a disrespectful local bigwig in his place during a country club event. Her loyalty to her husband and disdain for arrogance were clear. I laughed, easily imagining the scene based on my time in her courtroom. "You're different from most lawyers," I told Henry. "My dad worked over 30 years at CAT, and my mom raised 5 kids. When I got into law school, Dad hugged me and said, 'Don't become an a-ho.' He's 90 now, but he'd still set me straight if I needed it." After thanking Henry again, I walked away, determined to rebuild my life. Well-meaning friends and coworkers kept trying to set me up with women they thought would help me move on. The problem was, I wasn't looking for another relationship. Everything was still too raw. I just needed to blow off steam without strings attached. Unfortunately, dating someone's sister or cousin wasn't the right way to scratch that itch. Instead, I frequented bars known for casual hookups and even took dance lessons. Women love a guy who can lead on the dance floor and buy a couple of drinks, and I wasn't short on opportunities. But there were risks to playing the field. One night, I hit it off with an attractive woman. As we left the bar, I noticed a faint tan line on her ring finger under the light. Alarm bells went off. "Are you married?" I asked. Her deer-in-the-headlights look told me everything. "Yes," she admitted hesitantly, "but my husband's away." "Where?" "Afghanistan. He's in the army." Fury surged through me. "Your husband's risking his life and you're out looking to cheat on him? You should be ashamed of yourself." She broke down, collapsing onto the pavement in tears. "I'm sorry. I'm such a hoe. He's been gone 5 months and I worry every day. I got so lonely, and some guys at work kept hitting on me. I didn't want to cheat with someone I'd have to see again, so I went out tonight. I just wanted to feel like a woman again, to feel a man's arms around me. I didn't even know if I could go through with it. I'm sorry." Looking across the street, I spotted a late-night diner. "Put your ring back on," I said. "Let's get some coffee." I handed her my handkerchief to dry her tears. She looked at me gratefully as we walked. I didn't have it in me to judge her further. Life had a way of breaking people in ways I was only beginning to understand. Kelly and I spent the next hour in the diner as she opened up about her husband, Sergeant John Tyler, and the 2 co-workers at her office who had been harassing her. Their relentless advances had worn her down, leaving her vulnerable and confused. I urged her to report them to HR, and she reluctantly agreed. I drove Kelly home that night, and we made plans to have lunch the following Saturday so I could check in on her progress. Over the next few weeks, we met occasionally for coffee and sandwiches, just talking. She eventually told me the company had transferred her to a new division and reprimanded the 2 men. One afternoon, she walked into the coffee shop, her face glowing. "John's coming home in 2 weeks," she exclaimed. I congratulated her and let her know it would likely be our last lunch together. Though she looked a bit sad, she nodded in understanding. "Thank you for being my friend, Les. You helped me through some dark times, and I'll never forget it." A few days later, I walked out of my office to find a massive man in fatigues waiting for me. I recognized him immediately from the photos Kelly had shown me, John Tyler. "Are you Thomas Lester?" he asked. I didn't offer my hand, letting him set the tone. "Let's go somewhere to talk," he said. We agreed to meet at a bar a few blocks away, each driving separately. At the bar, I bought the first round. "Kelly told me everything," he said. "It's rough coming home to hear my wife confess she went out looking for a fling." "Well, it didn't happen. Not with me, and I doubt it did with anyone else." "She loves you, John. She just had a weak moment." "Why didn't you take advantage?" he asked bluntly. "My ex-wife cheated on me. I know how it feels, and I wouldn't do that to another man, especially one in uniform." "Did you ever serve?" "No, I didn't have it in me. But I respect the hell out of guys like you who do," he sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm crazy for risking my life and marriage over there. I've been thinking of leaving the Army and finishing my degree. I was studying electrical engineering before I enlisted. If you apply to Purdue, let me know. I've got connections that might help." I handed him my card. He studied me for a moment. "I don't think we can be friends. Every time I see you, I'll think about how close Kelly came to cheating. But I appreciate what you did for her. I understand. The offer still stands, though. Call me if you need help." We sat in silence for a while, finishing our beers. Before leaving, he shook my hand. "You're a different guy, Lester. Thanks for everything." Weeks later, I received a letter from Kelly. John had left the Army, and they were moving to Texas, where he would finish his degree at Texas A&M. They planned to start a family after he graduated. She thanked me again and wished me well. Despite my own experience, I hoped they'd build a strong marriage. Deep down, I still believed in love. About a month later, I was surprised to find Gwen's younger brother, Pete, at my front door early one Sunday morning. Their father sat in the car parked in my driveway. "Les, Dad and I need to talk," Pete said. "Pete, you're welcome inside, but your father can stay in the car," I replied flatly. Pete relayed the message, his father visibly irritated, as Pete returned alone. I poured Pete a cup of coffee and sat down. "Gwen's in a bad place," Pete said. "Yesterday, Dad and I pulled her out of Brad's apartment. He hit her, and she's pretty bruised up." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said evenly. "But that's not my problem. Gwen and I have been divorced for 6 months. She's been crying nonstop," Pete continued. "She says leaving you was the biggest mistake of her life. Dad and I were hoping you might take her back." I shook my head. "I'm sorry she's hurt, but I could never trust her again. She broke my heart." "Where is she now?" "At the Holiday Inn. She didn't stop us from coming to see you, but she couldn't face you herself." "I hope you help her find a safe place, but it won't be with me," I said, standing to signal the conversation was over. Pete rose reluctantly and shook my hand. "For what it's worth, I don't blame you. You treated her well and she threw it away. I had to try. Goodbye, Les." As Pete left, I avoided looking at their father. I heard the car pull away, and that was the last I ever saw of Gwen's family. Later, mutual friends told me she moved north, taking a job in Northbrook with Allstate. The year following my divorce was filled with fleeting encounters, over a dozen 1- or 2-night stands. I wasn't proud of it, but each left me a little more whole. Practice, as they say, makes perfect. I met Grace at a concert on the ISU campus, not a rock concert, but a performance by a Chicago chamber orchestra featuring variations on La Folia by Salieri and other Italian composers. The petite woman sitting next to me, with her Twiggy-like features and mod Brit vibe, struck up a conversation during intermission, asking if I was enjoying the music. Grace, a graduate student in graphic arts and a cellist, agreed to let me buy her a drink after the concert. At the pub, we exchanged stories. Despite her name, Grace wasn't raised in a religious household. Her parents, former commune members, named her after Grace Slick from Jefferson Airplane. When I mentioned living in a farmhouse, her face lit up. After walking her home, I got a cheek kiss and her number. Intrigued by how different she was from anyone I'd met, I called her the next day, and we planned to attend an art exhibit the following weekend. Work went well that week. I'd earned a promotion and a pay raise, so by Saturday, I was feeling great. When I picked Grace up on the sunny April afternoon, I considered suggesting beers on a patio instead of viewing student artwork, but I stuck with the plan. At first, I regretted it. Many pieces seemed designed solely to shock, including a triptych that blatantly depicted Mary in explicit acts with the Holy Trinity. Disgusted, I whispered, "I think I'm ready to leave." Grace squeezed my hand. "Let's check the next gallery first. If you still feel that way, we'll go." Reluctantly, I followed her, and was relieved to find artwork that actually inspired thought and emotion. One painting caught my attention. A man and woman, nude, walking down a staircase. Their faces were captivating, full of unspoken tension. Then I noticed the woman wore a wedding ring, but the man's hand was bare. The title card read, "Oil on Canvas, Le Dernier Après-midi des Amoureux," by Grace Powell Adams. "You painted this?" I asked, stunned. She smiled knowingly. "Yeah, do you like it?" "It's incredible. What does the title mean?" "The Lovers' Last Afternoon." "Ah, now their expressions make sense. Why is it their last?" "I can't decide. What do you think?" she asked. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. But before I could, Grace pulled me toward another room to show me a second piece. This one, a vibrant animation drawing of a giant fish tank teeming with life, was a complete departure from the first. "This is amazing," I said. "My niece would love it. Why is all the great art tucked back here, and that other stuff front and center?" Grace laughed. "The professor curating the show is trying to impress the Chicago avant-garde crowd. Rumor is he's also sleeping with the student who did the Unholy Trinity piece." "Well, at least you have good taste," I said, earning another laugh. After the exhibit, we headed to the pub and spent hours talking. Grace surprised me with her grounded perspective, especially given her unconventional upbringing. She explained that the commune wasn't the free love stereotype people often imagined. "My parents were monogamous," she said. "I didn't lose my pureness until college, and I've only had a few partners." Yet her painting of the lovers was undeniably sensual. When I commented on it, she clarified, "Closeness isn't a contest. It's about sharing something meaningful. That's what made those relationships special. It wasn't about my pleasure or theirs, but ours." Grace's honesty and insight left me intrigued, and I couldn't wait to see her again. The evening air turned cooler, signaling the end of a long day. Grace mentioned she needed to leave early to finish a project for school. It had been a wonderful first date, and plans were made for her to come to my place for dinner the following week. On Wednesday, Grace arrived promptly. She was drawn to the overgrown garden patch in my backyard, intrigued by the tall fence and the buried portion designed to keep rabbits out. After a quick inspection, she joined me for dinner, where we talked about her life and interests. Grace shared details about her studies, her love for art, her ability to speak Italian and French, and her skill as a cellist. She even joked about her lack of athletic ability and nervousness in public situations, painting a vivid picture of someone deeply talented but unassuming. Before leaving, Grace proposed planting a garden in my backyard. She offered to handle all the work, from planting to harvesting, in exchange for sharing the produce. After discussing logistics, I agreed, drawn as much by the idea of fresh vegetables as by the thought of seeing more of Grace. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace worked tirelessly in the garden. She called me before each visit, and I often came home to find her immersed in the soil. One day, she rented a rototiller to prepare the ground, and I helped her finish the job. When a load of manure arrived, we spent a rainy weekend spreading and mixing it into the soil. Grace seemed overjoyed, expressing how much she missed the connection to nature and the satisfaction of working outdoors. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I began to appreciate the process myself. During one of these evenings, Grace mentioned her lease would soon be up and her roommates were graduating. She asked if she could rent my spare bedroom, offering to pay rent and share household expenses. Though I had hoped our relationship might become romantic, I agreed, knowing I enjoyed her company too much to turn her away. We discussed arrangements, dividing costs and responsibilities. Grace seemed thoughtful and considerate, ensuring everything was planned. With that settled, she left, promising to return soon to begin planting. As I watched her leave, I wondered what the future might hold for this unexpected connection. A warm, sunny Saturday morning seemed perfect for a productive day. I decided to bike into town for some office work, leaving Grace a note on the kitchen table to let her know I'd be back by 4 and hoped we could have dinner together. However, upon arriving, I realized the IT department had shut down the system for upgrades, a detail I'd completely forgotten. Despite the wasted trip, I was in a good mood. There was still time to enjoy the day and spend it in the garden with Grace. I headed home whistling. As I approached, the driveway gates were closed and Grace's car was parked inside. Curious, I peeked around the house toward the garden. There she was, working with a hoe, completely undressed except for her gardening boots. Her back was to me as she bent over to plant seeds, her movements deliberate and fluid. I froze, caught between admiration and guilt for watching. Not wanting to intrude, I decided to retreat and make noise as if I'd just arrived, giving her a chance to cover up. But as I turned, the barn cat darted in my path. I tripped, the bike clattering to the ground, and Grace spun around in alarm. She spotted me, froze momentarily, then reached for a nearby dress. In that moment, I saw everything: her petite frame, flawless skin, and natural beauty. Realizing I'd been caught, I locked eyes with her and saw something deeper in her hazel gaze: vulnerability, curiosity, and maybe even desire. Without thinking, I rushed into the garden, wrapped my arms around her, and kissed her. To my relief, she kissed me back. It felt natural, inevitable. I told her I loved her, surprising even myself. Grace admitted she'd been unsure about how I felt, and assumed I saw her only as a friend. She had doubted her own appeal, comparing herself unfavorably to the photos of Gwen I still had in the house. I reassured her, confessing how beautiful and unique I found her. She seemed to believe me, her hand brushing against my arousal, a playful smirk forming on her lips. Moments later, I carried her into the house and to the bedroom. There was no hesitation as we embraced, ignoring our sweaty and dirt-covered bodies. The passion between us was raw and overwhelming. Afterward, we showered together, playfully washing away the grime before falling into bed again, this time exploring each other more slowly and intimately. Later, as we lay together, Grace asked if this meant she'd no longer need the second bedroom for herself. I smiled, realizing she wanted to move in permanently. She promised to wait until after finals, but agreed we were no longer just roommates. I couldn't resist asking about her gardening without clothes. She explained it was something she'd grown up doing, a way to feel connected to the earth. Swimming, too, was something she'd always done nude. Skinny dipping in the commune's lake had been her norm. The thought stirred something in me, and Grace teased me for it, climbing onto my lap and drawing us into another slow, sensual moment. We didn't get much planting done that day, but we eventually made it back to the garden, embracing the new rhythm of our relationship. One that seemed perfectly natural, like working the soil under the sun. Gardening without clothes had its appeal, but I couldn't wait to try skinny dipping next. It never crossed my mind to let Brad walk away unscathed after his role in wrecking my marriage. While Gwen bore equal responsibility for its collapse, Brad had brazenly disrespected our vows and pressured her to financially cripple me during the divorce. He deserved payback. I wasn't in a rush to exact revenge. As my relationship with Grace deepened, I questioned if it still mattered. The answer was clear. It did. But violence was out of the question. I wasn't willing to risk jail time, knowing full well I wouldn't last a day in prison. Instead, I turned to the internet. Over 2 years, I spent an hour a week researching Brad online, using aliases to quietly monitor his life. Patience paid off when an opportunity arose. Brad, now engaged to a stunning woman and working in IT at a conservative brokerage, was ripe for a reckoning. With the wedding weeks away, I decided to save his fiancée from future heartbreak. For $4,000, I set my plan into motion. Brad was a regular at a local hotel bar on Wednesdays, sticking around after most of his coworkers left. Enter Lacey, the Chicago call girl I hired. She didn't need much effort to lure Brad to her room. A little eye contact, a drink, and a few flirtatious exchanges later, he followed her upstairs. Hidden cameras recorded everything. As they began, there was a knock at the door. Lacey introduced Philip, her supposed co-worker, who pitched the idea of a threesome. Brad, already caught on film with the courtesan, agreed to participate. Whether it was Lacey's offer of backdoor, the thrill of a threesome, or sheer recklessness, he didn't hesitate. The footage revealed everything clearly. Lacey managed the situation with precision, keeping Brad distracted while ensuring key moments were documented. Screenshots, carefully cropped to protect identities, provided undeniable evidence of Brad's actions. One moment stood out as particularly revealing, highlighting Brad's inattentiveness to what was happening around him. Reviewing the footage with Lacey the next day, I selected the most incriminating stills. True to our agreement, her and Philip's identities remained protected. Lacey even offered me a free service, but I declined, committed to Grace and unwilling to jeopardize our relationship. The plan was a resounding success. Brad's behavior was thoroughly documented, leaving no room for denial. His fiancée received an anonymous package of photos just days before the wedding. I never checked to see what became of him afterward. My satisfaction came from knowing Brad had been exposed for who he truly was, sparing another person from the same pain he had caused me. Brad, still shouting profanities, bolted into the bathroom to wash his face. Meanwhile, Lacey and Philip gathered his clothes, removing his phone and wallet. As Brad stormed out, furious and ready for revenge, Lacey coolly tossed his belongings out the door, forcing him to choose between confrontation or retrieving his things. Opting for the latter, Brad dashed into the hallway, allowing Lacey to slam the door behind him. While Brad pounded on the door, screaming obscenities, Lacey calmly called the lobby to report a disturbance. The commotion drew neighboring guests, some capturing videos of the undressed man ranting in the hallway. These clips later surfaced online, further amplifying Brad's humiliation. Hotel security eventually chased him out of the building, while Lacey and Philip slipped away, never to be seen in Peoria again. The best screenshots from the hidden cameras, including the infamous money clip of Brad's face covered in Philip's contribution, were selectively distributed. Copies were sent to Brad's boss, his fiancée, her father, a few of his close friends, and a voyeur website. The fallout was as spectacular as expected, leaving Brad disgraced. I debated whether to reveal my role, but ultimately decided against it. Escalating the situation could jeopardize my relationship with Grace, and Brad had already been thoroughly humiliated. He left town shortly after, though the evidence of his actions would linger online for years. The next 15 months with Grace were the happiest of my life. Living and loving together in the farmhouse, she introduced me to new books and ideas, broadening my horizons. That summer, I met her parents at the commune and was surprised by their warmth and generosity. The 4th of July celebration there was one of the most memorable experiences I'd ever had. Grace even convinced me to try skinny dipping. Late that first night, with everyone else asleep, We swam together under the stars. By the following year, I was swimming nude in broad daylight alongside 20 others. Despite my initial hesitation, the experience felt surprisingly natural. Just a group of people enjoying the water and sun in a carefree way. 5 weeks before Grace's graduation, she shared bittersweet news. She'd been offered a job in Paris with a company producing an animated adaptation of A Christmas Carol. While I was thrilled for her, the thought of her leaving was difficult. Grace explained that this opportunity could establish her career and make future freelance work more viable, though she promised she'd return. I knew it wasn't fair to hold her back. Despite my heartache, I told her to accept the offer. Over the next few days, I wrestled with whether to give her the diamond ring I'd bought as a graduation gift, but decided against it. She needed to chase her dream without feeling tied down. On the day Grace graduated, we celebrated with her family before driving to O'Hare. She left her car, belongings, and most of her art supplies at the house. Her mother hugged me tightly and whispered, "She loves you. Trust her." I kissed Grace goodbye at the terminal, watching her disappear into the airport, a place I now loathed more than ever. First Gwen, now Grace. This time, though, it wasn't an ending. It was a new chapter. I clung to the hope that Grace would return and we could pick up where we left off. For now, all I could do was wait. We kept in touch constantly, letters, emails, photos, and weekly Skype calls. We planned for me to visit Paris during my next vacation, but none of it truly eased my loneliness. Depression settled in, and even the garden Grace and I had planted was left to fend for itself. Most of the crops were close to rotting when a couple of co-workers visited and, seeing the state of things, asked if they could harvest the vegetables. I told them to take whatever they wanted. Debbie King, one of our admin assistants and a widowed mother of 2, came by that Saturday with her boys. They spent hours gathering crops. When I asked what she planned to do with all the vegetables, she said her neighbor was teaching her to can food for winter. I offered her some jars I had left from Grace's canning projects, joking that she'd have to return them if we needed them next year. Debbie smiled knowingly and said, "She loves you, Les. She'll be back." I mumbled a quiet, "I hope so," as I walked back into the house, letting her leave with her boys, boxes of produce and jars in tow. Grace was planning to come home for 10 days over Christmas and New Year's, but we decided I'd visit her in Paris in early November. She'd be working during the weekdays, but we'd have the evenings and weekends to enjoy together. Boarding my flight, I hoped my streak of bad luck at O'Hare was finally behind me. When I arrived at de Gaulle, Grace was waiting for me outside customs. The sight of her felt like the sun breaking through clouds. We embraced and kissed, prompting a few onlookers to clap. After grabbing my bag, we took a cab to her apartment. Barely inside the door, we were already pulling off each other's clothes, savoring the closeness we had missed for so long. Her apartment was a tiny efficiency, barely big enough for a pull-out sofa that passed for a bed. It was uncomfortable, but Grace's laughter and teasing about her French luxury made it impossible to complain. She pointed out that some of her co-workers lived in even worse conditions. I didn't care. With her in my arms, it felt like home. Jet lag caught up with me after our first round of lovemaking, and I fell asleep. Waking briefly in the dark, I relished the warmth of Grace's undressed body wrapped around mine before drifting off again. The next time I woke, she was dressed for work, kissing me softly. She promised to return in the evening, and we'd have the weekend to ourselves. Once she left, I explored the apartment. The kitchen was little more than a counter with a mini fridge and a hot plate. Grace had left instructions for the coffee pot and a baguette with jam for breakfast. After getting ready, I ventured out to explore Paris on foot, soaking in the city's charm. By late afternoon, I was back in the apartment reading when Grace burst through the door. She declared she wouldn't let me out of her sight for the next 64 hours. I joked about staying in, but she reminded me of her fridge's size and Parisian dining habits. She suggested we make love before dinner, already shedding her work clothes, and I couldn't argue with her reasoning. Saturday was a whirlwind. We visited the Musée d'Orsay, had lunch near Notre Dame, and took in the city's vibrant atmosphere. That evening, Grace introduced me to her coworkers at a restaurant. It was clear she was well-liked. Her colleagues were eager to meet the man who had captured her heart. As I sat among them, listening to their stories and laughter, I felt the weight of the months apart lifting. Being with Grace again reminded me of how much she meant to me and how lucky I was to be in her life, even if only for a short visit. When we arrived at the restaurant, introductions were quick, handshakes with the men and air kisses with the women. We settled into small groups, and I found myself chatting with Holly, an English woman, Megumi, a Japanese woman, and Claude, a Frenchman. Despite their accents, Megumi and Claude spoke better English than Holly, whose British slang threw me off. Grace flitted between clusters, her French flowing easily in conversations. Our group's conversation started lightheartedly with a debate over rock and roll. Holly and Claude teamed up to argue for British supremacy, citing Exile on Main Street as the pinnacle of rock. Megumi sided with me, crediting Elvis and Chuck Berry as the true pioneers. Her personal favorite? Cheap Trick's Live at Budokan, which she grew up hearing on her mother's vinyl. The exchange was friendly and fun, with no one taking it too seriously. When I jokingly asked Grace for her pick for the best rock singer, male or female, she declared, without hesitation, Grace Slick. The mood shifted abruptly when Grace raised her voice in heated French, berating Jean-Paul, one of her co-workers. Everyone fell silent, watching in stunned amazement. Even patrons at nearby tables paused to listen. After a minute, Grace apologized to the group and announced we were leaving. Outside, I asked what had happened. She explained that Jean-Paul, a classic chauvinistic jerk, had insulted me in French, assuming I wouldn't understand. Grace overheard and refused to let it slide, defending my honor. She also revealed that Jean-Paul had been pestering her for a date, despite her repeated rejections and clear declaration of our relationship. Renee, who invited Jean-Paul despite knowing the tension, added to her frustration. We met Grace's co-workers again before my trip ended, this time without Jean-Paul or Renee. Claude made a point to assure me that not all Frenchmen shared Jean-Paul's anti-American sentiment. The evening was drama-free and a lot of fun, reinforcing my faith in our future together. The following months dragged. Winter on the prairie felt endless, and I missed Grace terribly. Her visit during the holidays helped, but her absence after was even harder to bear. Though we planned a March visit, Grace warned that her work hours were overwhelming as her project entered crunch time. With deadlines looming, I canceled my trip, counting down the weeks until her June return. By May 10th, spring was finally in full swing. After work, I drove home, looking forward to relaxing on the porch with a beer. The weekend before, I had rented a rototiller to prep the garden, thinking of Grace as I worked the soil. I had vague plans to plant some tomatoes and beans, but mostly enjoyed the connection to her it gave me. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the gates were closed. Curious, I parked and walked toward the house. There, in the garden, was Grace, leaning on a hoe, completely undressed. We stood frozen for a moment, staring at each other before she dropped the hoe and ran into my arms. She explained that her project had wrapped early and she'd volunteered to leave, catching the first flight home. She had hoped to surprise me and asked if it was okay. I didn't answer. Instead, I rushed inside, retrieved the ring I had hidden in the safe, and dropped to one knee in front of her. "Will you marry me, Grace?" It took her a moment to process, but when she found her voice, she said yes. Laughing, she suggested Sunday for the wedding, just enough time to get a license and invite our families. We married in the garden, muddy as it was. Both sets of parents, a few siblings, and close friends attended the intimate ceremony. Grace, much to my parents' relief, wore a dress. We stayed in the farmhouse until the harvest, spending the summer searching for a place of our own. We found the perfect property north of town near the river. It had 4 acres with 2 wooded, plenty of room for Grace's garden, and a large garage that would double as her studio. We planned to live in the existing double-wide while building a house, though construction stalled when winter arrived. Grace, now freelancing and painting full-time, sold one of her works, Le Dernier Après-midi des Amoureux, for $8,000. Her success meant she could focus on her art and the garden while preparing for her next role, stay-at-home mom. Our first child was due in May, and Grace wanted a big family. I couldn't believe how lucky I was, married to my dream woman, living on a beautiful property, with a great job and a baby on the way. The only challenge? Convincing Grace to keep her clothes on while gardening next spring, especially with the builders on site.